Some specs on might help. Vital. I would. Order, order. The sitting is resumed. Order. Colleagues, I want to begin this session by marking the terrorist attack in London on the 29th of November, during which Saziska Jones and Jack Marriott lost their lives. I am sure the whole House will join me in sending our condolences to their families. Yeah. Order. The House has directed the Speaker to make a statement at the beginning of each session about the duties and responsibilities of honourable members. I begin by reminding honourable members of their duty to observe the code of conduct agreed by the House and to behave with civility and fairness in all their dealings. We all have duties to our constituents, but we are also part of a wider parliamentary community. I consider it essential that all honourable members, both new and returning, undertake the Valuing Everyone training. The Behaviour Code applies to members as it applies to others who visit or work in Parliament and provides clear guidance. Unacceptable behaviour will be dealt with seriously with independently and effective sanctions. The House asserts its privilege of freedom of speech. It is there to ensure that our constituents can be represented by us without fear or favour. It is in the obligation upon us all to exercise that privilege and responsibility. Members must be mindful of the impact of what they say, not only on other members, but on others who follow our proceedings, and members should be heard courteously, whatever their views. That privilege is enjoyed by members of Parliament only in their work in this House. As private individuals, we are equal under the law with those whom we represent. Parliament should be open to those whom it represents. We should seek to explain its work to those who elect us and to make them welcome here. The security of this building and those who work and visit here depends upon all of us. We have a duty to be vigilant and to assist those whose job it is to maintain this place as a safer place of work. Before moving the first business of the new Parliament, I would like to express my very best wishes to all honourable members, those newly elected and those returning, and all who work within this House. Yeah. Not at this stage. No, absolutely not.
Outdoors, though.
Sorry, folks. Cabinet now. Leader of the House to move a motion on the temporary deputy speakers. Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I beg to move that for the period up to the first sitting day following the election of the deputy speakers, under Standing Order number 2A, Sir Roger Gale be Chairman of Ways and Means, Sir George Howarth be First Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, and Sir Gary Streeter be Second Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means.
The question is that for this period, up until the first sitting following the election of the Deputy Speakers under Standing Order number 2A, Sir Roger Gale be Chairman of Ways and Means, Sir George Howarth be the First Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means, and Sir Gary Streeter to be the Second Deputy Chairman of Ways and Means. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that for the period up to the first sitting day following the election of the Deputy Speakers under Standing Order number... Don't make me straight to the way that. Still on, it's doubled up. Before calling the Minister to move the next motion, which relates to the presentation of the European Withdrawal Agreement Bill and the sitting of the House tomorrow, I want to make a short statement. substantive motions may be moved without notice, only with the sanction of the Chair and with the concurrence of the House. I am exceptionally allowing this motion to be moved only for 4 reasons, which are unlikely to apply to other motions without notice. First, I am satisfied that there has been proper engagement through the usual channels and with other parties about the contents of the motion. Second, informal notice of the motion has been given by means of inclusion in the Chamber's information note. Third, it offers the House a choice between a sitting tomorrow and a sitting on Monday if the motion was not agreed to. Fourth, the motion enables the House to see the contents of the bill to be debated earlier than otherwise would have been possible. I now call the Leader of the House to move the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, for allowing this motion. I beg to move that 1. Notwithstanding the provisions of Standing Order number 57 and the practice of this House, at this day's sitting a Minister of the Crown may, without notice, present the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, and 2. This House shall sit on Friday, the 20th of December 2019. Subject to the House agreeing this motion, I shall make a business statement this evening following the debate on the Queen's speech.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and welcome back. Can I say and agree with you that it is a highly unusual motion, and I'm pleased that the business managers have agreed this motion that we can sit tomorrow, and that the bill will be published and it will be scrutinised by Her Majesty's opposition, so that we look at it in the best interests of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and on that basis we support the motion.
Much, Mr. Deputy Speaker, and Mr. Speaker even, sorry about that. Old habits die hard, Mr. Speaker. I resign. Can I also say this is a very unusual state of affairs, and you have been generous to the government in order for this debate to go ahead tomorrow. This is what it's all been about for the last 3 weeks, ensuring that they get their disastrous, dismal Brexit tomorrow. Scotland opposed it in 2016, it opposed it last week, and we will vote against it tomorrow.
Notwithstanding the provisions of Standing Order number 57 and the practice of the House at this day's sitting may, without notice, present the European Withdrawal Bill, and that this House shall sit on Friday the 20th of December 2019. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. And just to say for the record, I did negotiate to ensure that we weren't coming back after Friday. Right. I wanted the House to be in the right place, and I think that was part of my duty. We now come to presentations of Bill. State Stephen Bartlett. Nods. Brilliant.
European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. I have to acquaint the House that the House has this day attended Her Majesty in the House of Peers, and that Her Majesty was pleased to make the most gracious speech from the throne to both Houses of Parliament, of which I have obtained a copy for greater accuracy. I shall direct that the terms of the speech be printed in the votes and proceedings. Copies are available in the vote office. I have the gracious pleasure that I shall, first of all, ask Tracy Crouch to move, then Eddie Hughes to second the address. Tracy Crouch.
I beg to move that a humble address be presented to Her Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that this is quite possibly the most terrifying thing I have ever done, it is of course a great honour as the re-elected and proud member for Chatham and Aylesford to move. This speech is usually a gift reserved by the whips for those thought to have had their best times. The Chief, a man well known for his elegance, charm and wit, has clearly clocked its panto season. So for asking me to do this is the equivalent of shouting, "Your career is behind you." Mr. Speaker, I think we could do a bit better than that. And frankly, frankly, Mr. Speaker, I'd feel a bit more reassured if indeed the Prime Minister could perhaps join in. So if I may, the Chief, a man well known for his elegance, charm and wit, has clearly clocked it is panto season. For asking me to do this is the equivalent of shouting, "Your career is behind you."
Oh, no, it's not!
I said it's...
You shall go to the ball.
Instead of Cinderella or Puss in Boots, let's us raise the literary tone and note that today is the anniversary of A Christmas Carol being published in 1843. Now, Charles Dickens was a son of Chatham, and so this old has-been speech clearly makes me feel like the ghost of Christmas past. The member for Walsall North will presently play the ghost of Christmas future. And the Prime Minister is oven ready for the role of Christmas present. Now, Scrooge would have been brilliantly played by the former Chancellor, Philip Hammond. But was sadly pipped to the part by the last Speaker of this House, who auditioned powerfully for the role for many a bleak year. Old Marley sits on the front bench opposite, chained and regretful. And that's just about Arsenal's recent performance.
Smile, Jeremy, it won't kill you.
But who, Mr. Speaker, who is our tiny Tim? So valiant and small, the object of universal pity. It could be none other than the Right Honourable Member for Westmoreland and Lonsdale, for whom we welcome back to the House and wonder if he'll have another go at his party's leadership.
He's not here.
Now, I had thought, Mr. Speaker, of continuing the Love Actually election theme by delivering a speech on bits of card with the parliamentary choir singing carols in the background. But one, we are not allowed to bring props into the chamber. Two, I think Hugh Grant has suffered enough. It would be simply impossible to fit all the names of the new Conservative intake. Now, I note that the last Kent MP to have proposed the Loyal Address was Bob Dunn, the long-serving member for Dartford, who started his speech by mentioning that he had been returned as a member in 4 successive general elections, and at each election the Conservative vote had been significantly higher than the time before. Well, thanks to this Prime Minister, I now know how he feels. This legislative programme outlines plans for a bill authorising the construction and operation of High Speed 2, but it was that Queen's speech of November 1994 that the legislation for High Speed 1 was tabled. Along with his constituency of Dartford, High Speed 1 travels through mine and many others in Kent. He spoke of its potential virtues, predicting the economic benefits associated with it, and he was right. Thanks to that bill 25 years ago, there are parts of Kent that have seen major regeneration thanks to a much reduced travel time into London, and there is still even more potential to unlock. Now, I'm privileged to be the member for Chatham and Aylesford, a diverse constituency with a strong naval history. A friend and mentor of mine, the member for North Thanet, mentioned to me earlier this week that he's now the only Kent MP to have been serving while the Chatham Dockyard was still operational. But then rumour has it he's also the only Kent MP to have been here when the last Thanet MP proposed the Queen's speech in 1937. Alas, Sorry, Sir Roger. Alas, the dockyard, while not within the boundary of my constituency, has always been of critical significance to the town. It ceased operations in 1984. However, its regeneration has been remarkable, paying tribute to its heritage through housing, employment and tourism. Now, another female member of the 2010 intake to have proposed a Queen's speech is, of course, my right honourable friend, the member for Portsmouth North. Like Chatham, her constituency is built very firmly on the foundations of the Royal Navy. And, of course, she famously littered her speech with bits of the male anatomy as a dare from her colleagues in the reserves.
Steady.
Now, I thought I would seek her advice, given I know that I would feel sick to the core and shaken with fear, whereas she herself has shown with great calmness and tranquility during tough times at the highest level. She looked at me, she took my hand and she said, "Tracy, you'll be fine, just don't cock it up." Now, I note that the last humble address to take place after a December election was proposed by Mr. Reginald Mitchell-Banks from Swindon. Hansard notes that he delivered his speech in court dress, a tradition I am grateful no longer exists.
Shame.
Although if Hansard wishes to note that I'm wearing high street chic, they are of course welcome. Mr. Banks spoke of the importance of trading with our friends abroad and of course the bonds of commerce and enterprise between the United Kingdom and those countries both near and far have only strengthened since. The famous Watling Street, a trading route used by ancient Britons, Vikings, Saxons and Romans, runs through Chatham, and it was on that road that famous battles were fought against Roman invaders. But I'm delighted to say that things have changed, and it's on that road today, now known as the A2, along with the M20 running through Aylesford, that goods come and go from the port of Dover, which, as the Foreign Secretary now knows, is a rather important trading point. It is in that spirit, Mr. Speaker, of being open to the world that 96 years on from that election and its subsequent humble address, we have proposed legislation that, by delivering on Brexit, creates new and exciting trading opportunities, and it starts in this House tomorrow with the Withdrawal Agreement. This bill will unlock and unleash Britain's potential with the rest of the world, alongside other pieces of Brexit legislation announced this morning. We stand ready to build a new relationship with our friends in the EU and elsewhere based on free trade and cooperation. And then, thanks to the legislative programme put forward today, we can raise our own standards in areas like agriculture and, of course, my own personal passions of animal welfare and the environment. The reintroduction of the Environment Bill will protect and restore our natural environment for generations to come, set ambitious, world-leading but achievable programmes to tackle pollution and enable us to make the most of our much-loved landscapes. For those of us with densely populated, polluted constituencies, with its large pockets of green space under threat from inappropriate and strategically ill-thought-through planning proposals, demonstrating that these fields not only provide a haven for wildlife, but a breathing space in urban areas that enhance health and well-being of our residents, is our last remaining hope. But as well as other extremely important pieces of legislation, I know from my campaigning throughout the election, my constituents will warmly welcome plans to enshrine in law increased funding into the NHS, greater access to GP appointments, fairer funding in education, more police officers and tougher sentencing for serious criminals. They will also be delighted to hear a further commitment to supporting those with poor mental health. Members of this House, including myself, have spoken powerfully and personally about their own brushes with various mental health conditions. It is right that we help remove the stigma around mental health by talking about it, but it is action, not words, that matter. And so it's paramount that we ensure that our constituents, whose voice may not be as loud as our own, receive the treatment that they need by guaranteeing that we treat mental health with the same urgency as physical health. I was proud that our manifesto included commitments to improve the overall well-being of the nation. And while there may not be in the legislative programme outlined today, measures such as investing in grassroots sport, enhancing physical education in schools and reform of the out-of-date gambling legislation, the Prime Minister should know that there is wide cross-party support for such improvements to begin their laborious Whitehall process, and I hope they will do so soon. Mr. Speaker, I made my maiden speech during a debate on poverty. Part of my constituency suffers enormously from deprivation, and I work alongside many organisations to support those who find themselves unable to cope. Charles Dickens chronicled vividly the poverty of Victoria Britain. inequalities which were alleviated in the ensuing 180 years by moderate, enlightened governments of all colours. Mercy and altruism must remain our mission in today's One Nation Conservative Party. I've worked with many MPs from other parties in this House on various issues. And of course, I welcome and congratulate my new colleagues on these benches, but there are friends opposite who I will miss enormously. And although we've not covered ourselves in glory for these past few years, new MPs will soon discover that this place is at its best when we work together and relationships and friendships will be formed over issues that need cross-party consensus if they are to progress. Chatham's hero, Dickens, may have been a great social reformer, but he also observed that there is nothing in this world so irresistible as laughter and good humour. Perhaps it would be no bad guide for us as we repair this House of Commons in the coming months. Let laughter and good humour replace recent rancour. Let friendships thrive through adversity. And let us respect our differences, but not let them divide us. And of course, let Tottenham finish above Arsenal in the league.
That's a given.
So as I finish my humble offering to Her Majesty, may I take this opportunity to wish colleagues and all the hard-working House staff a very Merry Christmas, a Happy Hanukkah and a peaceful holiday season, and in the words of Tiny Tim at the end of A Christmas Carol, God bless us everyone.
I call the member for Walsall North. Any use?
Mr. Speaker, I hope you will forgive me if I look slightly bewildered being called to address a full House of Commons chamber. I've simply never had this experience previously. In fact, over the previous 2.5 years, I've got used to being called at the end of a debate to address a House of Commons chamber that's almost completely empty, and then being given 2 minutes to make a 10-minute speech. So, Mr. Speaker, if you like what you hear over the next few minutes, I would like to think you will call me early in debates, unlike your much-loved predecessor. But for the moment, Mr. Speaker, I'm just going to relish this amazing opportunity to talk to all of these people. And it is an incredible privilege to be seconding the gracious speech, but it's also an incredible privilege to follow on from my dear and good friend, the Honourable Member for Chatham and Aylesford. Now, if I remember correctly, she won her seat in 2010 from a Labour member. Now, if my maths is right, we've got 50 new Conservative MPs in this chamber that have won their seats from Labour members as well, and from right across the country, from Innismon to Ipswich, oh, you had to ruin the flow, didn't you? Come on, guys. You're meant to be nice. To me, I meant. Anyway, back to it. From Innismon to Ipswich, from Kensington to Blythe Valley. And I think anybody who's got a political bone in their body should just take a minute to remember how they felt when that Blythe Valley result came in. Now, Mr. Speaker, I won my own seat in 2017. But it was from a Labour member, but it was 1976 when the Conservatives last won that seat, and they only managed to win it at that time because John Stonehouse, the Labour MP, faked his own death. While on a business trip to Miami, he left a pile of clothes on the beach, pretending that he'd gone for a swim, never to be seen again, supposedly. Well, I tell you what, he was a damn fine swimmer. Because 5 weeks later, he turned up 10,000 miles away in Melbourne, Australia. Now, he was arrested and he tried to apply to a couple of countries for asylum, but that didn't happen, so he was deported back to the United Kingdom, and incredibly, while out on bail, he continued to serve as a Labour MP. Now, I'm not sure, but I don't think the Right Honourable Member for Witham, the Home Secretary, would allow such leniency these days. But I did find it amusing when I read a line on Wikipedia that said the Labour Party were unhappy with this situation but chose not to expel him. That sounds like a familiar theme these days, I think. Anyway, for those of us who are 2017 MPs, this has felt like a very precarious innings, like we're never more than 5 weeks away from a general election. So I was getting a bit concerned because my predecessor in terms of Conservative MPs, who is now Baron Hodgson of Abbots Astley, I think, hopefully Hansard will correct that if I got it wrong, he managed to serve 910 days as the MP for Walsall North. Now, when Parliament was dissolved on the 5th of November, I'd served 881 days. I know, thank you for playing your part. So I knew I had to win that election. I had to beat the Baron. But anyway, the good omen for me and for this incredible Conservative victory should have been apparent to me on the 27th of April this year, because with just a few days to go before the local elections, I was visited by a man who was, at that time, the humble backbencher, the Right Honourable Member for Uxbridge and South Ruislip. He wasn't the Prime Minister then. Anyway, to the House, the blonde bombshell was unleashed on the unsuspecting people of Bloxwich, and the result was truly magnificent to behold. Everybody who asked for a selfie was greeted with a beaming smile and an occasional tussle of those famous blonde locks. And when our tour reached its inevitable destination, the Bloxwich Showman, the future Prime Minister obviously pulled a pint of Thatcher's Gold. Now, I know what you're thinking, Mr. Speaker. You're thinking, so what? What was the consequence of this great visit? Well, the consequence for me was that in those local elections a few days later, we won 2 more council wards against the national trend, and for the first time ever, the Conservatives took control. First time in 20 years, the Conservatives took control of Walsall Council outright. Yeah. Now, that shouldn't have been a surprise, maybe, because over the past 3 years, we've had a blue-collar revolution. Yeah. The working people, the working class of Britain have sent 2 shock results to Westminster. And who led both of those campaigns? One man who completely understands that actually what the public want, what ordinary working people want, is a government that will stay out of their way, but will ensure they have safe streets, a good standard of education for their children, and a great national health service when they need it. We now have a government and a Prime Minister that understands that and will deliver. Yeah. People lent us their vote in this election. We cannot let them down. We must not let them down. We will not let them down. Yeah. But Mr. Speaker, I think you know the answer to this question. What is the first priority for this country? Oh, you're supposed to say get Brexit done. Anyway, get Brexit done. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, in an interview immediately after the election result, I think I heard the Right Honourable Member for Hayes and Hollington, the Shadow Chancellor, say that he now understood that the public wanted to get Brexit done, but the Labour hadn't been listening. Now, in my constituency of Walsall North, 74% of people who voted in that referendum voted to leave. But that wasn't the interesting thing for me during the general election. When I was telephone canvassing, I spoke to lifelong Lib Dem voters who had voted Remain in the referendum, but were now voting Conservative because they said they were real Democrats. Yeah. They knew how important it was for this country to deliver on the result of that referendum. Yeah. But Mr. Speaker, Walsall North is like many of the constituencies we've just won. It's among the most deprived constituencies in the country. But now we have a Prime Minister who completely understands that although ability is equally distributed across the country, opportunity is not. Yeah. And that's why we're going to transform further education system, by investing in a huge new rebuild programme worth £1.8 billion. But investment in infrastructure is also incredibly important. There are towns like mine, Willenhall, where the manufacturing base has been decreased over recent years. So I was delighted to work with the Mayor of the West Midlands and secure the money for a new train station for Willenhall, because that train station will be a lifeline for that town. It will allow the people of Willenhall to travel to Birmingham or to Wolverhampton more easily for job opportunities or for education opportunities. But it will also allow people to travel in to Willenhall. So if we can continue to remediate those old industrial sites, we automatically free up new opportunities. And I'm imagining a time where we've got a robotic factory in Willenhall making goods that would otherwise be brought over from the other side of the world, therefore also reducing our carbon footprint. But, Mr. Speaker, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what about the I'm going to look on the camera to see who said that. That's not what you were thinking, Mr. Speaker. I know you. You were thinking, what about the NHS? Is it safe in this Conservative government's hands? Mr. Speaker, let me tell you, it certainly is in Walsall North, because thanks to the Health Secretary, I've got £36 million for a new A&E department, which is going to increase capacity as well as improving conditions for staff and patients alike. What about the rest of the country, though? I don't know where to begin. 50,000 extra nurses. Thank you. 50 million extra GP practice appointments per year and 40 new hospitals. But what about the future of our great nation, Mr. Speaker? Well, I'm delighted to read that this Conservative government, by the end of this Parliament, will be investing a stonking £3.2 billion a year in research and development. Although I completely agree with the Honourable Member for Harborough, who said we simply cannot continue to have half of that money spent in just 3 cities, London, Oxford and Cambridge. We need to spread that throughout the country. So, Mr. Speaker, from my personal point of view, it certainly looks like the country's future, the future of the whole United Kingdom, is incredibly bright with this Conservative government. And so as we look to 2020 with a newfound spirit of optimism and ambition, it is my privilege, on behalf of the great people of the Black Country, to commend this gracious speech to the House.
The question is that the humble address be presented to Her Majesty as follows. Most gracious Sovereign, we, Your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, the Commons of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, in Parliament assembled, beg leave to offer our humble thanks to Your Majesty for the gracious speech which Your Majesty has addressed to both Houses of Parliament. I now call the Right Honourable Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's the tradition at the beginning of each session of Parliament to commemorate former members of the House who have died. And it's only been 2 months since the last state opening, but in that time, sadly, we've lost our great friend Frank Dobson, former MP for Holborn and St Pancras. Frank was a very, very committed Health Secretary from 97 to 99, who began the rebuilding of our National Health Service after being so disgracefully run down by the Conservative government at that time. He was always an incredibly friendly face, always full of anecdotes and jokes that I can't repeat here, and he'll be greatly missed by all of us on this side of the House, and I suspect many others who knew him as a thoroughly decent Member of Parliament who was very committed to his constituents and to the cause of good housing across the country. We've also lost David Lambie at the magnificent age of 94. David was the Labour MP from 1970 to 1992, and I knew him very well as a very committed peace campaigner. On Tuesday, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister and I both remembered Saskia Jones and Jack Merritt. the wonderful young friends who died in the appalling terror attack in the Fishmongers' Hall. And it's right that, again, we pay tribute to them today for the way in which they lost their lives and the message they left behind. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome all new members to the House, on both sides of the House, because being a member of Parliament is a massive achievement, it's a massive honour, and I would have thought in witnessing our opening proceedings today, many must think, what on earth have I taken on? Is the pantomime season has come very early this year. But I think that, yeah, look behind you. If I may continue, Mr. Speaker. And I would also like to pay tribute to those members who lost their seats in the general election, because to serve in Parliament and fight an election and then not be returned is an amazingly traumatic experience when they put such huge amount of work in to the campaign and the work that they've done. And the trauma they must all feel is something that I think everyone in this House should just think on for a moment, on the human side of what it is like to go through that experience. So I pay tribute to them and thank them all. I won't mention all the names, but one I want to particularly draw, well, if I could just commemorate and thank the amazing work and presence that Dennis Skinner has been in this Parliament through all the years that he was an MP. And, Mr. Speaker, I would like to congratulate the proposer of the Loyal Address. The member for Chatham and Aylesford showed passion and integrity. And that's what she became known for since her very principled resignation from the government over its failure to restrict fixed odds betting terminals. And I thank her for that. But I'm afraid that, Mr. Speaker, is where we part ways. For is anything that can drive a wedge between two people, even more than a Brexit vote in this place, it's the North London rivalry between Spurs and Arsenal. These things may seem trivial, but some, as the great Bill Shankly once said, put it this way: some people say football is a matter of life and death. I'm very disappointed in that attitude. It is much more important than that. And to put it another way, that'll help the honourable member, Arsenal won 13 league titles, Tottenham too. But we take our victories where we can find them. But I do want also to compliment her, particularly on the last part of her speech dealing with the natural world and the environment. I think it was incredibly important and very well put. And can I also congratulate today's seconder of the Loyal Address, the member for Walsall North, for his speech and the spirit with which he gave that speech. I got a sense of the spirit of Walsall when I was in Walsall College recently. Wonderful place and wonderful students. Members opposite are renowned for their membership of various clubs. The Bullingdon Club, the Reform Club, and so on. There's many of those clubs. But I was absolutely overjoyed in researching the member to find that he is a member of one of the greatest and most prestigious clubs of them all. The honourable gentleman is a trustee of the Walsall Wood Allotment Charity, which is a fantastic honour. I'm sure everyone will agree. And he will understand more than most the ecstatic pleasure that we allotment holders, also the proposer, get from our allotments and the produce we get from them. So I hope this will provide an opportunity for a genuine bipartisan working relationship over the onions and the carrots. Mr. Speaker, it's just 2 months ago that the Prime Minister made the Queen come here in the rain as part of a pre-election stunt. Since then, he has made many promises to many different parts of the country. He has promised to address problems that are a result of his own party's actions in government and their political choice to impose austerity cuts on this country. There can no longer be any doubt that austerity has caused unnecessary suffering to millions of people all across this country. The communities to whom the Prime Minister made his promise will now judge him on whether he keeps them. In this Queen's speech, the government has tried to mimic some of the priorities and, interestingly, much of the language of Labour policies, but without the substance. On austerity, on investment, on regional inequality, on the National Health Service, we can see how we forced the terrain to shift. They say, Mr. Speaker, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, even if it's very pale imitation. But I fear that those who were swayed by the Prime Minister's promises will be sorely disappointed. As this Queen's speech shows, what the government is actually proposing is woefully inadequate for the scale of the problems that this country faces. Our NHS, the country's most precious institution, is on its knees due to this Tory government. The government now talks about enshrining the funding settlement in law. Enough of the gimmicks, just fund it properly. I don't remember the last Labour government having to pass a law to force itself to invest in the NHS. Yet it increased NHS funding by a rate of 6% per year. This government is proposing little more than half that, less in fact than the historical average. The gap between the government's rhetoric on the NHS and the reality is enormous. Last week, for the first time ever, every single major accident and emergency unit in England failed to hit its 4-hour waiting time target. Every major unit failed to meet the target. Every single one under this government. The number of people in England waiting for operations is the highest since records began, 4.4 million. And the number of unfilled staff vacancies has ballooned. The Prime Minister's promise of 50,000 extra nurses was quickly revealed as a sham. 19,000 of them already work for the NHS. And his promise of 40 new hospitals turned out to be a reconfiguration of just 6. Mr. Speaker, the public will remember this. They will not look kindly on promises that are not kept. This government says it will take action on hospital car parking fees, following our lead, but where we propose to abolish them, only apparently some people will be entitled to free parking under their plans. It was the disastrous Health and Social Care Act, brought in by the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats when they were in coalition, which flung open the door to privatisation, which is the cause of so many problems in our NHS. Yet the Queen's speech says nothing whatsoever about the Health and Social Care Act and the privatisation that it's brought. Not so long ago, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister stood on the steps of Downing Street and announced he had a plan to solve the social care crisis. So where is it? It wasn't in his party's manifesto, and all we have today are empty words about bringing forward proposals. Perhaps we shouldn't be surprised. All we had in the last Queen's speech were empty words about bringing forward proposals. And in the Queen's speech before that, what do we get from the Conservatives? Empty words about bringing forward proposals. At least they've got continuity on this. Cuts to adult social care are expected to reach almost £8 billion by the end of 2019-20. But the government is only putting £1 billion back in. It's like taking £8 from someone and expecting them to be grateful when you give them back £1. So when it comes to young people, Mr. Speaker, the government seems to have just given up altogether. This is yet another Queen's speech that's miserably weak on education, nothing for early years, nothing for colleges, nothing for universities. The government clearly has not heard the anxious cry of parents and teachers about school funding, overcrowded and unqualified teachers. The funding promised for schools will still leave them hundreds of millions of pounds worse off in real terms than they were in 2010. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to Brexit, the election result demonstrated a strong determination from many people across our country to end the mess and paralysis of the last 3 years. We understand that people are desperate to move on. That does not mean we will just accept the Prime Minister's reckless approach on how it's done. He has now deliberately resurrected the threat of no deal at the end of next year, which would decimate industry and destroy people's jobs. That threat is now written into the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. The Prime Minister has shown time and time again his priority is a toxic deal with Donald Trump that will sell out our NHS, risk the safety of our food, our environmental protections and workplace rights. We do not want our NHS given over to US corporations. And we don't want expensive medicines with extended patents. And we don't want food like chlorinated chicken on our dinner tables either. We know that the Prime Minister's deal won't put Brexit to bed. It will just be the beginning of years of more drawn-out negotiations. Mr. Speaker, it's been reported that the government wants to scrap the Department for International Development, a proud achievement of Labour in government. Will the Prime Minister confirm that this government will not close DFID? And will he ensure that 0.7% of the UK spending continues to be used to help end global poverty and destitution? I note the commitment to develop a sanctions regime to directly address human rights abuses. That sounds like good news for Saudi Arabia. Should the Saudi regime be worried, or will the government continue to ignore their human rights abuses and their war crimes in the Yemen that have resulted in famine and humanitarian disaster? According to the UNHCR, the Refugee Commission, there are almost 71 million forcibly displaced people around the world. Where is the government's commitment to do anything for those desperate people fleeing war, violence and famine? Around the world, Mr. Speaker, Britain should stand up for human rights and democratic rights, including the right of workers facing exploitation and abuse. So it's very worrying that here at home, the Conservative government is planning an assault on workers' rights to withdraw their labour, beginning with the transport workers. No worker, Mr. Speaker, goes on strike lightly, but we will oppose any attempt to curtail that right. We've already seen some of the most draconian anti-worker laws, and now the government seeks to take us even further back in time, again in breach of the conventions of the International Labour Organization. In a country where pay is too low, work too insecure, and bad employers too common, attacking the rights of the working people to stand up for themselves is a completely wrong-headed approach. And on the subject of transport, with planned transport investment in the north, less than half that in London, what assurances can the Prime Minister give that the commitments on investment in the Queen's speech are not just another failed gimmick like the Northern Powerhouse was? We should take it, Mr. Speaker, as a form of flattery that on investment, the words of the Queen's speech echo what Labour has long argued, that investment is desperately needed in every part of our country. But the scale of investment planned by the government falls woefully short of what is required. Speaking of falling woefully short, this Queen's speech contains nothing of substance to deal with the colossal challenge of climate and environmental emergency. Net zero carbon emissions by 2050, which is the government's target, is too late, and in any case, at the current rate of progress, we won't reach net zero until 2099. Any target date will be fanciful if action doesn't start now. What are the Prime Minister's plans on climate for this year and for each year after that? It's clear that COP25 this year was a failure. Next year, Britain has the honour of hosting COP26, and frankly, I think it would be embarrassing for all of us to host such a vital conference if we are not doing enough to reduce our own carbon emissions and show we've made some real progress towards bringing forward the target date. The government needs to get serious and put young people's futures before those of the big polluters, many of whom fund the party opposite. Mr. Speaker, this Christmas, thousands of people will be sleeping rough on the streets thanks to this government and its housing policy. Rough sleeping has doubled under the watch of the Conservative Party in government. Everyone who sees people huddled in doorways in the cold in the 5th richest country on earth knows it is morally wrong. Shelter says that 280,000 people will be homeless on Christmas Day in England alone, either rough sleeping or living in temporary housing or hostels. So can the Prime Minister explain why there is no mention of homelessness in the Queen's speech and why there is so little to address the housing crisis? Could it be because he doesn't want to upset the billionaire landlords who back his party? The Prime Minister has used Labour's idea of offering discounted homes to first-time buyers. It's OK, it's more flattery, but let's see the substance of it. What reassurance can he provide that this won't go the same way as the failed Starter Homes programme? Remember when we were promised 200,000 starter homes in 2015, but as yet we've seen absolutely zero. The fire at Grenfell Tower exposed a housing system that is fundamentally broken. Yet 2 years later, 319 of the 446 buildings covered in aluminium composite cladding have not had it removed. Imagine living in one of those buildings and feeling at risk. Probably not something many members of this House go through, but an experience that thousands of people go through every day, living with the fear of a burning inferno in which is their home. So will the Prime Minister now set a hard deadline for all landlords to replace dangerous cladding? And will he fund the installation of sprinklers in high-rise social housing blocks and reverse budget cuts to the fire service? Mr. Speaker, we will look at the findings of the Government's Royal Commission on the criminal justice process. But I simply say this: any changes in sentencing must be done in consultation with anti-terror experts and not as a knee-jerk reaction to make political capital. Mr. Speaker, this Queen's speech is notable for what's not in it. Does nothing for students who are being lumbered with huge debts, does nothing for older people unable to pay their heating bills this winter, does nothing to address the levels of poverty in our country. And this year, the United Nations, yes, the United Nations itself, had to take our government to task over the shocking fact that 14 million people are living in poverty in this, the 5th richest country in the world. Shouldn't that be a source of shame to this government? Shouldn't their Queen's speech contain something to address this? Why is there not even a mention of universal credit, the cruel policy that has ruined so many lives? Why is there no commitment to immediately raise the minimum wage to £10 an hour so that people can no longer have to work their fingers to the bone and still remain in poverty? These things aren't in the Queen's speech because this government, that Conservative Party, does not stand for the people at the receiving end of their policies. Despite all their promises, that is exactly what this Queen's speech shows. Mr. Speaker, the central aim of my party, the Labour Party, is to stand up for working people, for every part of this country, for the many, not the few, to deliver social justice, prosperity and a society that works for all. As this government ploughs ahead with its programme of gimmicks and false promises, we will be holding them to account every step of the way and campaigning inside and outside Parliament and across this country for the real change that this government sadly will not deliver, but that our country so desperately needs.
I now call the Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is the moment to repay the trust of those who sent us here by delivering on the people's priorities with the most radical Queen's speech for a generation. And if there was one resounding lesson of this election campaign, one message I heard in every corner of these islands, It's not just that the British people want their government to get Brexit done, though they do. They want to move politics on and move the country on. Building hospitals, renewing our schools, modernising our infrastructure, making our streets safer, our environment cleaner, our union stronger. And this Queen's speech of this people's government sets in motion a vast interlocking programme to unite and level up across the whole United Kingdom and unleash the potential of all our people. This one nation government will enshrine in law record funding for our NHS, take back control of our borders with a wholly new immigration system, toughen our criminal justice system with longer sentences for the most dangerous offenders, double investment in basic science research, and protect our environment with a bill so ambitious and so vast that there is no environmentally friendly way of printing it off. And Mr. Speaker, this is not a programme for 1 year or one parliament. It is a blueprint for the future of Britain. Just imagine where this country could be in 10 years' time. Trade deals across the world, creating jobs across the UK. 40 new hospitals, great schools in every community, and the biggest transformation of our infrastructure since the Victorian age. British scientists using new gene therapies to cure the incurable, the hitherto incurable, and leading the dawn of a new age of electric vehicles, not just cars, but planes, pioneering solutions to the challenge of climate change. And I do not think it vainglorious or implausible to say that a new golden age for this United Kingdom is now within reach. And in spite of the scoffing, in spite of the negativity, in spite of the scepticism that you will hear from the other side, we will work flat out to deliver it. Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty's gracious speech was expertly proposed by a beacon of our one nation conservatism, my honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesford, who is not only a football coach of great distinction, who has done much to champion the female game, which will be a key part of this country's bid for the 2030 World Cup. But she is so personally skilled at the game, with what has been described by her adversaries as a take no prisoners style, that according to the Daily Telegraph, and if you can't believe the Daily Telegraph, Mr. Speaker, what can you believe? She was once barred from playing against men to protect their egos, and has even used this dispatch box. For an impromptu game of kicking up. He uses this dispatch box as a goal mouth, Mr. Speaker, in what was probably one of the less shocking innovations tolerated by the previous Speaker. My honourable friend has also done pioneering work on tackling loneliness, improving dementia care, and curbing the harms, as we've heard, inflicted by gambling and alcohol, and is so dedicated to her job that she's regularly brought her son Freddie into the lobbies, so reducing the voting age to about 6 months. And Chatham's great parliamentary sketch writer, Charles Dickens himself, would confirm that her speech was in the very finest traditions of this House. She was followed with great style by my honourable friend, the member for Walsall North, when he addressed this House for the first time in 2017. He said, and I quote, "The good people of Walsall North have had to wait 41 years to hear a maiden speech from their MP. You can imagine how disappointed they will be." Well, my honourable friend was being characteristically modest, but I cannot help noticing how the good people of Walsall North have taken drastic steps to avoid another maiden speech. They not only re-elected my honourable friend, but they've quintupled his majority just to be sure. Mr. Speaker, as the honourable member, gentleman, right honourable member of this has pointed out, you wait years for a Queen's speech, and then along come two in short order, something my honourable friend will appreciate as one of the growing number of bus drivers' children on Conservative benches. He was elected as a. I know you want to ask about. I know the honourable gentleman wants to ask about buses, but I must make reference. He was elected as a blue collar Conservative. from a traditionally Labour seat, a path that many have just followed. And since then, as he pointed out quite rightly, he has secured funding for a new A&E department at his local hospital, a new railway station for Willenhall. I know he comes from a Labour family. In fact, I think his brother is a Labour councillor. And when he first declared himself a Conservative, he felt, he said, like the black sheep of the family. All I can say is I bet if they're watching today, they will feel nothing but pride in my honourable friend's brilliant speech. Mr. Speaker, let me also welcome to his place, let me welcome to his place, right honourable gentleman, the leader of the opposition, a stickler, as we all know, for watching a Queen's speech at the right time. Though I don't know what he has against coronation chicken, Mr. Speaker. As our exchanges across these dispatch boxes come towards a close, alas, let me say that our personal relations have always been excellent, and as for all our disagreements, I have never doubted that the right honourable gentleman's beliefs are deeply held, and his sincerity is to be admired. Certain members of his shadow cabinet, on the other hand, are absolutely clear where the responsibility of the election result lies. The voters of the country have let their side down, let his side down. They have forfeited the confidence of the opposition, and the time has come for Labour to take the only possible step: dissolve the electorate and replace it with a new one. At least I think that's what the lady for Islington and Finsbury said. For my own part, Mr. Speaker, I feel a colossal sense of obligation to the electorate that I and we are humbled to serve, and to those people who lent us their votes, however hesitantly. This government will now engage flat out on a programme of change for the better. Tomorrow is the day when we finally peel back the plastic wrapping about which you have heard so much, Mr. Speaker, and present our oven-ready deal, and it will go into the microwave as the withdrawal agreement. It works in both devices, this deal. Taking back control of our money, our borders, our laws, our trade, clearing the way for an overarching programme of national renewal. And above all, it is time to invest in that institution that gives the country its cohesion and even our national spirit. The simple and beautiful idea that whoever you are, the NHS is there for you when you fall sick. And as our NHS cares for us, so we will care for the NHS, delivering the biggest cash boost in a generation, and for the first time this Queen's speech guarantees a new funding settlement in law. And what will that pay for, Mr. Speaker? I hear you ask. The biggest hospital building programme in living memory, with 40 new hospitals, 50,000 more nurses and their bursaries, 6,000 more GPs, 50 million more GP appointments, and we will introduce an NHS visa, a new NHS visa, to fast-track talented staff from overseas. We will scrap those iniquitous hospital parking charges for all staff and vulnerable people, and we will guarantee dignity and fairness for everyone in their later years with a long-term and sustainable solution to social care. And indeed, I invite cross-party work on that solution in the spirit of cooperation that I think is supported by many, many members on both sides of this House. And, Mr. Speaker, while many of these measures were indeed foreshadowed in the last Queen's speech, fortified by our new mandate, we will go even further. We will give millions of tenants greater rights over their rented homes, abolishing no-fault evictions. We will help millions of commuters whose lives are made miserable by strike action, by imposing minimum service agreements. On that, I'm happy to give way. If he's opposed to helping struggling commuters, and I'm delighted to hear from him. Come on.
Earlier on, he used the slogan "People's Parliament," but the people of Scotland rejected his government. And if he really believes in the people, isn't it right the people of Scotland should have their say in a referendum?
Mr. Speaker, I think it was Nicola Sturgeon herself who said that the referendum in 2014 was a once-in-a-generation event. And I don't know about you, Mr. Speaker, but I feel that the Scottish Nationalist Party should concentrate more on delivering on the domestic priorities of the people of Scotland and rather less on breaking up our United Kingdom. We will abolish. I believe, Mr. Speaker, that if I gave way to the honourable gentleman, I would be forced to repeat the point I've just made. We will abolish the threat of no-fault evictions, and we will take forward our plans to rejuvenate and, in some cases, and in many cases, Mr. Speaker, to revolutionise the infrastructure of Britain, including Northern Powerhouse Rail. We will remedy the scandal that Leeds is the largest city in Western Europe without a light rail or a metro. We are dramatically improving local bus services, levelling up across the country to the standards set in London, at least as they were set under the previous mayor. And we are investing nearly £30 billion in our road network, including upgrading the A66 to the first continuous dual carriageway across the Pennines since the 1970s. And above all, this one nation government will strengthen our United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the most successful union in history, and a sacred inheritance that this Parliament will never allow anyone to rip up or rend asunder. And we will stand by one of the greatest international symbols of British courage and daring, our armed forces. The men and women who sacrifice so much to safeguard our way of life. We will protect our protectors from unfair and vexatious legal claims which undermine their morale and confidence. And we will spare no effort in addressing the profound concerns of millions about the state of our criminal justice system, with the first Royal Commission for almost 30 years. And action now to impose tougher sentences on the most serious offenders. Now, if the honourable lady opposite actually wants to contest the need for tougher sentences for serious offenders, I'm happy to hear her view.
I'm very grateful to the Prime Minister for giving way. I'd like to ask him, in the Queen's speech there was mention of a sentencing bill. Will this include provision for increasing the sentence for death by dangerous driving from 14 years to life imprisonment? And if it won't, is the government open to accepting an amendment?
The honourable lady makes an important and valid point, and I have no doubt that she reflects the concerns of her constituents, and we will certainly be looking at what we can do to make sure that people who are guilty of dangerous driving do receive the penalties that they deserve. And I know that the Home Secretary will listen very carefully to what she has said. We will end the dangerous practice of early release of terrorists. But our reforms will only stand the test of time if our system of government here at Westminster meets the challenge of a new era. The steady erosion of faith in politics has poisoned our public life, and so we will establish a Constitution, Democracy and Rights Commission to recommend proposals to restore trust in our institutions and our democracy. And, as a first step, we will repeal the Fixed Term Parliament Act, so that never again can we have the ludicrous spectacle of an opposition party trying to defy the will of a majority of the House and run away from a general election. And we will do everything in our powers. To restore devolved government in Stormont so that Northern Ireland is once again ruled by its own elected representatives. And when it comes to standing by our friends, on the Northern Ireland, of course.
I thank the Prime Minister for giving way, and of course we all look forward to devolved government being re-established in Northern Ireland fairly and equitably for all. Will the Prime Minister make good on his commitment for a golden age of all of the United Kingdom by ensuring that he makes good on the promises made for bus building in Northern Ireland and for infrastructure in Northern Ireland, so as we can all enjoy the golden age of infrastructure and build the Boris Bridge, not just the Boris bus?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I think he can certainly be assured of my commitment to ensuring that beautiful buses continue to be built in Ballymena. And I will do everything we can to make sure that continues to be the case. As for his desire for a bridge to connect the two biggest Isles, in the British Isles, all I can say is a very interesting idea. I advise him to watch this space and indeed watch that space between those islands, because what he has said has not fallen on deaf ears, Mr. Speaker. And when it comes to standing by our friends, whether in Northern Ireland or elsewhere, one innovation that this Queen's speech introduces, Mr. Speaker, is that we will stop public bodies from taking it upon themselves to boycott goods from other countries to develop their own pseudo-foreign policy against countries which, with nauseating frequency, turns out to be Israel. Mr. Speaker, the scale of our programme is matched only by the sense of responsibility that falls upon us now, upon all of us now who have been elected. And again, I congratulate all new members, but a huge responsibility falls upon all of us now to redeem and to repay the trust of the British people. And I say to the people of this country, we owe you. We know it, and we will deliver. And we have now the energy, we have the ideas, we have the mandate, we have the people, and we will spare no effort to fulfil that mandate. And as we engage full tilt now in this mission of change, I am filled with invincible confidence in the ability of this nation, our United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to renew itself in this generation as we have done so many times in the past. And after the dither, after the delay, after the deadlock, after the paralysis and the platitudes, the time has come for change and the time has come for action. And it is action that the British people will get from this gracious speech, this most gracious speech, and I commend it to the House.
Mr. Speaker, and I hope before... Message to Scotland, One nation, Tories. One nation, Tories. Together, just out there.
Can people now leave quietly for those who are leaving? We will try again. Ian Blackford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was absolutely nothing in that address from the Prime Minister for the people of Scotland, and I hope for people that were watching and listening back home that it was led by the announcement, this is not for viewers and listeners in Scotland. Mr. Speaker, let me congratulate the member for Chatham and Aylesford and for Walsall North for their addresses this afternoon. And when I was listening to all the stories about Christmas Carol, of course we didn't hear from what member of the Conservative front bench would be playing Scrooge. And I must say to the honourable member for Walsall North, I know he's a great football fan. I thought he would perhaps mention Aston Villa. I know they're not having the best of times, but I hope he's enjoying watching John McGinn that we gifted from Hibernian to him last year. Mr. Speaker, this morning Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has written to the Prime Minister to demand the transfer of legal powers to the Scottish Government to hold a second independence referendum under Section 30 of the Scotland Act. Mr. Speaker, as the First Minister outlined, there has been a material change of circumstances since the independence referendum of 2014, based on the prospect of Scotland leaving the European Union against its will. And it is for the Prime Minister to explain to the people of Scotland why he is denying Scotland the right to choose our own future. Why did democracy stop in the Prime Minister's world with the independence referendum in 2014? And can I say to the Prime Minister, it is not a good look to see him playing with his phone rather than listening to the legitimate demands of the Scottish National Party. Of course, the Prime Minister says something more interesting. Well, Prime Minister, this is about democracy. This is about the Scottish National Party that stood in the election on a manifesto about Scotland's right to choose. And it was about the Conservatives that said no to Indy Rev 2. And, Mr. Speaker, what happened? Well, the Conservatives lost more than half their members of Parliament. Prime Minister, you got your answer from the people of Scotland. The SNP got 45% of the vote, a 20% difference to the government. 80%. We got 80% of the members of Parliament that sit on these benches. Someday, the Prime Minister is going to have to respect democracy. The Prime Minister can't and will not continue to say no.
To my right honourable friend for giving way. The Prime Minister says that looking at his phone is more interesting than hearing what Scotland needs. Doesn't that tell you everything? Doesn't that tell you everything about this Prime Minister and his view of Scotland?
Indeed it does. Mr. Speaker, well, you know, there isn't really much that can be added to that, because the image of the Prime Minister playing with his phone, not listening to the Scottish National Party, says it all. Mr. Speaker, the people of Scotland did not vote for this Prime Minister. Scotland did not vote for this Conservative government, and we certainly did not vote for this con of a Tory plan set out today. Mr. Speaker, in December 1967, my old friend Winnie Ewing proclaimed that the march of time can bring anomalies between elections, so that sometimes a government may have a majority in this House but be in a minority in the country. Mr. Speaker, in Scotland that is certainly the case. Here in this place we face a Tory government that we have rejected, implementing a manifesto that Scotland rejected. Mr. Speaker, for too many years Scotland has been held back by successive Tory governments that we didn't vote for. Mr. Speaker, SNP MPs have today set out an alternative Queen's speech to deliver for the people of Scotland with a renewed and strengthened mandate. Our expanded SNP team will focus on our priorities, on Scotland's priorities, on stopping Brexit and protecting Scotland's NHS from any grubby Trump trade deal, on dealing with the climate emergency and once and for all putting to an end Tory austerity. The government's Queen's speech instead sets out another Tory government that the people of Scotland rejected. Despite the fact that Scotland voted to remain a member of the EU, we now face being dragged out against our will. We often hear about losers' consent, but the fact of the matter here is that Scotland voted to stay in the European Union to maintain our rights as EU citizens. This Conservative government does not have the consent of the people of Scotland, does not have the consent of the Scottish Parliament or our government to take Scotland out of the European Union. Mr. Speaker, we ask that the solemn right claimed by the people of Scotland to determine the form of government best suited to our needs must be exercised. This claim of right was accepted as a principle in this House on a motion moved by myself in July 2018. Mr. Speaker, it is the Scottish people who are sovereign. In this context, it is right for the House to respect our Scottish Parliament and to respect the election result from last week. But of course, in the last Parliament, the Tories ignored our interest and sidelined the will of the Scottish Government, intent on bringing forward a deal that will destroy our economy, risk jobs and livelihoods. Mr. Speaker, as the former EU Permanent Representative to the EU, Sir Ivan Rogers, said, this pledge will create the biggest crisis of Brexit to date in late 2020. Get Brexit done is diplomatic amateurism dressed up domestically as boldness and decisiveness. From setting off our NHS to setting out Scotland's fishing communities. The Prime Minister will inflict hardship on our communities at the cost of delivering his damaging Brexit. And with the people of Scotland silenced, their voices silenced, the 80% of the seats in this House not listened to by a Tory government showing contempt. That's why, Mr. Speaker, we stand up for Scotland. That we stand up against these cruel, punishing policies and narrow, backward-gazing politics. And instead, Mr. Speaker, that we are determined that Scotland's right to choose our own future will be delivered. Not simply because we in the SNP want it, but because the people of Scotland are demanding it. We stood on a mandate to give Scotland the right to choose its own future, and I want to put the Prime Minister on notice. The SNP members on these benches will not ever stop fighting this government for that case, for our mandate to be respected, a mandate for a fresh independence referendum. Now, I see the honourable gentleman seeking to intervene. Will he accept democracy? Will he accept the right of Scotland to choose?
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way. Will he accept democracy? Will he accept that last week 55% of Scots voted for parties that want to remain in the United Kingdom? There is no mandate for a second independence referendum in Scotland. The Scottish people are not calling out for a second independence referendum. They want us to get on with the day job. Fix your own backyard first before you come in here demanding that the Scottish...
Well, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend says, what absolute tosh. You know, you cannot get away from the fact that we won the election. We sit here standing up as a voice for Scotland, and he lost most of his colleagues that were rejected at the ballot box. They've been reduced to a rump. And the fact of the matter is, Mr. Speaker, that we have got 80% of the seats on our side. The government could only wish that it had such a mandate, such a majority in the rest of the queue. The reality is, no Democrat can deny this. We won the election. We demand the right to have a referendum. Mr. Speaker, the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament has a strong record for bettering the lives of citizens across Scotland. And, Mr. Speaker, we know with more powers, with independence, we can and we will do so much more. Today, the SNP has published our alternative Queen's speech. The people of Scotland voted to lock Boris Johnson out of Downing Street and escape Brexit. Scotland voted to choose a better future. Our plan is to deliver that better future. We want to see a National Health Service Protection Bill to stop the NHS across the UK being at risk from a US trade deal. This will guarantee that trade deals will not undermine the founding principle of the NHS that we cherish so much. We will continue to make the case and work to ensure that Scotland's voice is heard and our nation has the right to choose its future. We will deliver in Scotland a bill to increase parental leave with an additional 12 weeks to be ring-fenced for the father in order to encourage take-up as well as to increase statutory maternity and paternity pay. The SNP New Green Deal will build on the transition towards a greener, sustainable future. And we will continue to press the UK Government to match Scotland's net zero emissions target by 2045 and putting oil and gas receipts into a net zero fund focused on measures to battle climate change, putting tackling the climate emergency front and centre of our priorities. That, Mr. Speaker, is what a responsible government does. And of course, unlike the Conservatives, our ambition is to end poverty, not increase it by a failure to act, a failure to show leadership. Poverty is not inevitable, and to fight it, we will work to end the disgraceful two-child cap on tax credits and associated rate clause. We call on the United Kingdom Government immediately to end the benefits freeze and to halt the rollout of universal credit. And, Mr. Speaker, we will use every device open to us in this place to make the case that we cannot allow our citizens to be dragged into debt, hardship and despair by this nasty, careless Tory government. We want to bring forward an equal living wage bill, meaning that living wage increases to at least the level of the real living wage and an end to age discrimination. Scottish National Party MPs reject the wholly immoral replacement of nuclear weapons at a cost of over 200 billion. And we call on other parties to follow us, to say no to Trident, to remove these weapons of mass destruction from the Clyde. And, Mr Speaker, we want to help our pensioners by ensuring the BBC licence fee remains free for those aged over 75. And just like we have done in previous parliaments, we will not abandon those women born in the 1950s by exposing and demanding that this government delivers justice for the 3.8 million women born in the 1950s, denied their pension by this Conservative UK government. We will be pressing for an NHS funding boost from the UK government that matches the current Scottish level, and for constitutional change and abolishing the House of Lords, extending the franchise to include 16 and 17-year-olds. Mr Speaker, this expanded SNP group is determined, and we are ready for the challenge. This government thinks it can do what it wants to with Scotland and get away with it. It will not happen on our watch. The Tories are risking our economy and reducing opportunities for citizens. Mr Speaker, the choice is clear. An outward-looking country with a vision of tolerance, inclusiveness and prosperity for all, in contrast to this offering of a union run by a Tory party who don't care about Scotland. The Tory programme for government that will push child poverty to a 60-year high and devastate our economy. The hardest of Tory Brexits that risks up to 100,000 jobs being lost in Scotland. The Tory manifesto means that in 2023-24, day-to-day spending on public services outside health would still be almost 15% lower in real terms than it was in the start of the 2010s. Austerity has hit the communities hard, and it's not going away. It is more of the same from the Tories. And despite the climate emergency, there is nothing in this Queen's speech to make real progress on reducing emissions. The UK government has already failed to match the Scottish Government's net zero emission target of 2045. And, Mr Speaker, that's just the start of it. And yes, the Conservatives can say England and Wales had its say. But what about Scotland? We had our say, and Scotland rejected this Prime Minister. Scotland rejected the Tories. For those of us who represent the people and the will of Scotland, we will use every avenue open to protecting our people against this government and its shoddy plan for government. Mr Speaker, before I close, I want to appeal to members across the House. In the last Parliament, members conducted themselves in less than acceptable ways on occasions. And people across these islands have recognised it, and they are fed up with it. So let us start this Parliament with respect and let the strength of our arguments win the case rather than dragging this place into the gutter. Finally, Mr Speaker, in setting out the SNP's clear opposition to the government's Queen's speech and offering our alternative, I have set out to the people of Scotland the tale of two governments, of two parties, of two futures. I started with the words of Winnie Ewing, and I want to begin closing with the words of another parliamentarian. Let me remind the House of the words of Charles Stewart Parnell. No man has the right to fix the boundary to a march of a nation. No man has the right to say to his country, thus far shalt thou go and no further. Now Scotland must have the chance to choose its own future, one shackled to the Brexit destruction imposed by Westminster, or one with hope, with opportunity and ambition, an independent Scotland in the European Union.
Former Prime Minister Theresa May.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and may I first of all take this opportunity of congratulating you on your election as Speaker. I know that you will reside in that chair and uphold the best traditions of the Speaker of the House of Commons. But I also want to thank you for the work that you have done, and I know you will continue to do, in showing a concern for the health and well-being, including the mental health, of members of this House and staff across Parliament. Thank you for all that you have done. Mr. Speaker, I've been in this House for over 22 years, and this is the largest number of Conservative members of Parliament I have seen in this House. And I would like to congratulate my right honourable friend for leading our party to an overwhelming victory. One thing now is certain. The lobby is going to be rather crowded. But may I just personally say it's going to be a rather welcome change to see all Conservative MPs going through the same lobby. I hope my right honourable friend will also forgive me if I just reflect that this was the result that was supposed to happen in 2017. But of course, back then, people still thought the Labour Party was supporting Brexit. 2 years on, they saw that was a sham, a pretence, and a betrayal of millions of traditional Labour voters. And those Labour voters have now elected Conservative members of Parliament. This victory brings with it a huge responsibility, because they have put their trust in us, and as my right honourable friend has said, we must work flat out to repay that trust. Not just government ministers, but every single one of us on these benches. And of course that means delivering Brexit. It means delivering on the manifesto commitments on schools, on the NHS, on infrastructure, which is why the legislation and commitments in the Queen's speech are so important. But it means more than that. It means truly building a country that works for everyone. And that has always been the ambition of the Conservative Party, because we are a party that is at our strongest when we appeal across the board to people regardless of age, gender, ethnicity, sexuality, background, income, where they live. That is the true Conservative Party. And so we must deliver on Brexit and those manifesto commitments, but we must go further. We must ensure that every decision we take in this House, we remember those communities who have lent us their vote. That means things like taking forward the modern industrial strategy, ensuring prosperity across the whole country, and I welcome the commitments in the Queen's speech on science, and spending on science and on research and development. It also means remembering those communities when we're negotiating trade deals around the world, including with the European Union. Because good trade deals will be ones that protect the jobs of those who have put their faith in us. But more than that, bring good, new, better jobs here to the UK. And isn't it interesting to note, we haven't actually, so far, I think, in this debate, had a reference to the fact that it is yet again under a Conservative government that we have seen employment go up. Good trade deals. Good trade deals also protect the rights of workers and those who have put their trust in us. And I welcome the commitment to an employment bill in the Queen's speech, which I trust is going to not only enshrine but enhance workers' rights in this country. And good trade deals also ensure that we maintain the high standards we have in this country in areas like the environment. And the Environment Bill is going to be a very important piece of legislation as it's set out in this Queen's speech. So we do need to deliver on all of these issues for people, and particularly for the communities who've lent us their vote, because these are the communities who felt most left behind by globalisation. These are the communities who all too often have borne the brunt when rights and standards are not protected. So we have got a very real job to do in terms of delivering for those people who have put their trust in us. And of course, We need, as we do this, as we deliver Brexit and look ahead to the end of next year, we have to deliver that trade deal with the European Union by the end of December 2020. There are those who say it cannot be done. I do not believe that. I have every confidence that it can be done. But we must do more than that, because by the end of December 2020, we have to have agreed and ratified, such that it will come into operation on the 1st of January 2021, a new treaty on security with the European Union. Again, I have every confidence it can be done, because a significant amount of work has already been put into these issues, and the elements of that are there, agreed with the EU in the political declaration. So there's work to be done, but it can be done, and it must be done to that timetable. Another issue, of course, which people across the UK will look to us to deliver on, are the social injustices that still persist. I welcome very much in the Queen's speech the reference to the domestic abuse bill. And I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for the speed with which he responded to me when I pressed him on this matter earlier this week. Instantly, indeed it was. That bill, which has cross-party support, is genuinely going to improve the lives of victims and survivors of domestic abuse. I also welcome the reference to reform of the Mental Health Act, although, yet again, I'm bound to say that I would have preferred a more full-blooded commitment to a new Mental Health Act. The review of the current Mental Health Act that we had raised so many issues about how we deal with and how we treat people with mental health problems. It's not just about resources. It's about the attitude and way in which people are treated. And if we put those changes into place in a new Mental Health Act, we will genuinely be bringing significant improvements to people in this country with mental health problems. But there are other social injustices we need to look at too. One of the things that underpins social injustice often is a feeling among the powerful that there are others in our society who they can treat as second-class citizens. I think one of the worst examples of this, or it brought it really home, was the way in which the girls who were being sexually abused and young boys being sexually abused and groomed in Rotherham were treated by the authorities in that place. It was as if these were people who did not count, but they did count. And we must always remember that every member of our society, every resident of the UK counts. It is that sense of ensuring equality that lay behind the work that was done on social housing. And I note the commitment the government has made to bringing forward a social housing white paper. I think it is very important that we continue with that work to ensure that the voice of those in social housing is heard. And then another injustice we need to address was highlighted by the race disparity audit. The race disparity audit was groundbreaking work by a Conservative government. It shone a light on injustice that too many experience and too few are willing to acknowledge. And it is important, we can't address all of the issues that were raised, all of the findings immediately. But we do need to ensure, and I want to ensure, that the government does not abandon the work on the race disparity audit. Because if we do take action across the board, then we will truly be creating one nation. Now, speaking of one nation, my right honourable friend has on a number of occasions expressed his desire to unite the country. Of course, that won't happen if the United Kingdom is torn asunder by those who want to ignore the ties of family, of history, of shared endeavour, over the years. My own view is very simple. I think that breaking up the United Kingdom is to the benefit of no one and the detriment of all. And I'm grateful to the right honourable gentleman for the reference in the Queen's speech to the integrity, the importance the government attaches to the integrity of the United Kingdom. And I look forward to the work that I know the government will be doing to ensure that that is demonstrated. I will give way once.
I thank the former Prime Minister for giving way, and she spent a lot of her speech speaking about the debt that her party and her successor owes to those who lent her party their support. But of course, she will know better than anyone that it is a true leader and a true statesman that acknowledges those who did not vote for them and that work for them. So I turn to the result in Scotland, where the SNP secured 45% of the vote. Nobody denies this Prime Minister's right to govern on 43% of the vote. So how can she turn round to the people of Scotland and say we cannot have our say on our own future after the general election that we just had in Scotland?
Can I just say to the honourable gentleman that, as he will have heard from my excellent honourable friend, the member for West Aberdeenshire and Kilmarnock, 55% of people in Scotland voted for parties that support the union of the United Kingdom. And it's all very well, I heard the right honourable gentleman, the member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, and he made this great plea at the end about how an independent Scotland was going to be in the European Union. We all know an independent Scotland will not be in the European Union. It will not be allowed to be in the European Union. So what the Scottish nationalists are saying to people in Scotland is simply not true. I want to raise, Mr. Speaker, I want to raise one final issue, which is referred to in the Queen's speech, in the reference that is made to the UK's place and influence in the world. And I note that there is going to be a full review of international policy, building, I have no doubt, on a number of reviews that have taken place in recent years and work that has been done. But it is very important that we look at this issue at the moment. Of course, global Britain has never gone away. We always have been a global Britain. We have, over recent years, continued to play an important role in international fora on issues such as climate change. We've played a key role in dealing with terrorism, with modern slavery, with people smuggling. We've enhanced our presence in key areas, east of Suez and the Asia-Pacific region. And, of course, we brought together action across the world when we found that a chemical weapon had been used on the streets of the UK by Russia. But at the same time, we have seen internationally the international fora and also the rules-based international order on which we have depended for decades coming under significant threat. At the same time as we have seen the atmosphere and discourse of politics in the UK become more acrimonious, so across the world we've seen a change too. And what we've seen is an emphasis on absolutism and confrontation rather than compromise. And we have a decision to take as to where we sit in that, whether we side with the absolutists or whether we actually continue to be a country that believes it is right that the countries will come together internationally, restrain their own demands in order to seek agreement for the greater good of all. And we've also seen some interest from some in stepping back from a defence of democracy, human rights and the rule of law. We have to decide whether to look inward or whether to continue to play a role in defending those values. I believe we should, because that is what global Britain is all about. And it is important that we continue to uphold those values around the world. Now, of course, this may bring into the spotlight our relationship with the United States of America. That is a special relationship that we must nurture and preserve. It is in the interest not only for us and the United States, but also for the world that that special relationship is maintained. But it's not a one-way relationship. We don't just accept every position the US takes. We consider our own interests, and when we believe and we disagree with them, then we tell them clearly that we disagree with them. But I think, as we have seen over the last 3 years, this House focusing so much on Brexit and focusing so much internally, now we have the opportunity. We can set that to one side and we can move on to being the global Britain that my right honourable friend has spoken about and that every Conservative member on these benches espouses. A Britain that is taking its place in the world. A Britain that is recognising the need to reform the international rules-based order, playing a role, not just a role in that, but actually playing the leading role in that reform. And a United Kingdom that stands up for the values that we share, the values of democracy, rule of law, human rights. A United Kingdom standing proud in the world. I believe the world needs the United Kingdom to take that role. And I know that under my right honourable friend, we will do just that.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the chair of this House. It's a pleasure, too, to follow the Right Honourable Lady, the member for Maidenhead, because despite our political disagreements, I think she and I agree on what she said about everybody counting and government being there for everybody. And I want to thank the people of Hackney South and Shoreditch who have re-elected me for the 5th time to stand up for all of them, not just the 73% of them who voted for me, but for the others who didn't as well. And I will stop at nothing, Mr. Speaker, to stand up for them in this House. Mr. Speaker, this Queen's speech is quite incredible. It talks about investment in education, the NHS and public services, but this by a government that has slashed spending over the last 9.5 years. The promise of more funding for schools comes now, but only after 9 years of funding cuts that have led to an 8% per pupil funding decrease over the last decade. And this is the government that talks about more police. But who was it, Mr. Speaker, who cut them in the first place? And the Prime Minister has been very keen to talk about the past as though it was a different country. And I simply, if he were in his place, would ask him and remind him that he has not just been the Prime Minister for a few hundred days, but he has been an MP, the Mayor of London. He cannot dodge responsibility. But I will, of course, welcome things in this Queen's speech when it will deliver for the people of my constituency. And while it is a bit bitter to hear the government talking about investment in broadband from the same government which rigged the last broadband competition for rural broadband particularly so that only one bidder could win, it is actually important that we do invest in this infrastructure in our country. And even in my constituency, even in Shoreditch, where we have the heart of the best tech businesses beating like a heartbeat for Britain, we have too poor a broadband service. So I will join with the government in supporting investment in broadband if they will deliver in my constituency and across the country. But I can't stand today, Mr. Speaker, without highlighting the real challenges of the people of Hackney South and Shoreditch. As the former Prime Minister said, everybody counts. In my constituency, that includes half of our children who live in poverty after housing costs are taken into account. In my constituency, or across Hackney, 30% of deaths are still premature, and the leading cause of that is cancer. So investment in our health service for early diagnosis and treatment is absolutely vital. And above average, 1/5 of adults smoke still in my constituency, compared to around 14% of the London population. And Hackney has the highest rate of diagnosed depression of any London borough, at nearly 1 in 10. So I welcome a review of mental health support, but like the Prime Minister, the former Prime Minister, I think we may need to be more radical than that, so I'll be watching that closely. And Hackney as a borough is the 11th most deprived of the 326 English local authorities. So while some people talk about us being achingly cool, they think of the hipsters with their beards, they think of our bread makers, our beer makers, and so on. A very high percentage of my constituents are in great need, with over a third living in financial poverty, earning 60% of median earnings after housing costs are taken into account. And I wanted to see this Queen's speech say a lot more about housing. In my borough, you have to have 17 times your salary is what would take it to buy a home. That compares with the London average of 13.8%, which is pretty high, and the England and Wales average, which is also high at 8 times the amount. But it means that home ownership is out of the reach of very, very many. And in my constituency, there are more private renters than there are homeowners. Half of all households are represented in social housing, which is more than the other two combined. But in a real stain on one of the richest companies in Europe and in the world, over 3,000 families are living in temporary accommodation. And just in the last few weeks, a man wrote to me begging for help because he has for 2.5 years lived with his 8-year-old son in one room in a hostel. And we have a fantastic Labour-elected mayor in Hackney who is doing his utmost to resolve this housing crisis, which is costly to the individuals concerned, costly to our communities, and costly to the taxpayer. But without more from this government, it will be difficult, if not impossible, to deliver for those 3,000 families who need help. Those children who will be living without a permanent roof over their heads and celebrating Christmas in one room, in a hostel, or in short-term, inadequate temporary accommodation. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I wouldn't want to suggest that this poverty is also a poverty of ambition. Because, boy, do my constituents want to get on in life. But without those basic building blocks of primarily secure, long-term, affordable housing, swift and easy access to proper health care, and secure, properly paid jobs, and access to skills development, they will never get there. Some in my constituency earn enough money to work a 4-day week. Many, many more work 3 or 4 jobs on poverty wages, on 0-hours contracts, just to make the rent. And there are invidious policies like the bedroom tax, which doesn't work. On one estate, the Wenlock Barn estate in Hoxton, 74 families are hit by this, and they don't have an option to move to a different property. It's a cloud cuckoo policy, and one if the Prime Minister is anywhere honest about his desire to be a one-nation Conservative, he would abolish right now. But all governments, Mr. Speaker, should be creating a ladder of opportunity for the people of this country. This government, or the governments before it, have ripped away the lower rungs of that ladder, so it is a very long reach for too many of my constituents. And I want to see some commitment that they will help my constituents. Moving on to some of the specifics of the Queen's speech, Mr. Speaker. Her Majesty talked about the government continuing to lead the way in tackling climate change. It has been my great sorrow, in one of my responsibilities as the former chair of the Public Accounts Committee, a role I hope to resume in this Parliament, that I have crawled over the detail of the government's policy on climate change. So what do we see? Carbon capture and storage, 3 expensive competitions, wasting millions of pounds achieving absolutely nothing. The much vaunted Green Deal, with the noble aim of greening our homes. Let's face it, more domestic emissions come from our housing than from aviation. But it was scrapped as a total failure, predictably, and it cost the taxpayer the equivalent of £17,000 per loan granted. I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I'm grateful to her for giving way. She's making a powerful speech. She will know that yesterday the Committee on Climate Change wrote to the Prime Minister to say that action on climate is falling short. Does she agree that that will continue to be the case for as long as this government does not commit to leaving fossil fuels in the ground? That means ending mass road building, ending mass aviation expansion, and also ending the mass subsidies to the fossil fuel industry.
Yeah. Well, I thank the Honourable Lady for her point, and I'm sure she'll be making it more firmly. But I think one of the things that I think is really concerning is we have to look at this in the long term. And let's be clear, governments of different colours were not dealing with this early enough and properly enough. But we now need to tackle it. And a government with a majority of 80 has every opportunity to be bold and ambitious in this direction. But it scrapped the Green Investment Bank. Well, it privatised the Green Investment Bank. It became the Green Investment Group, and it doesn't need to even deliver on any of its green principles. It's not very few guarantees about where that money will go. That would have been a huge opportunity had it remained in public hands to invest in emerging green industries, creating those jobs and opportunities as well as tackling climate change issues. And that was another opportunity squandered. And you compare this to what Labour in power can do, I just turn to my own borough, the Labour-run borough of Hackney, which has set very bold targets that it is achieving on tackling climate change. Already, half of the electricity for the council and local schools is generated from renewable sources, and by April of next year, that will rise to 100%. And only very recently, the council established a publicly owned clean energy company which will maximise all council-owned roof space to generate renewable electricity. It's decarbonising its vehicles, it's tackling so many other issues. I haven't got time to go into everything today, but it is setting the example of what can be done. If one London borough can do this, what could a government do if it set its mind to it? And the government really needs to step up. And I invite whichever relevant government minister, of course we wait reshuffles, to come and see what my borough is doing, and we can show you how we lead the way. The Queen's speech also touched on swift justice for knife possession. And this is a scourge of our young people in particular. There are too many people in my borough who are fearful of walking their own streets because of the impact of knife crime. And only during this election, another young man's life was lost and another family is bereaved. And I am angry, Mr. Speaker, and disturbed for the families that I have to visit, I choose to visit, who have lost loved ones, whose lives have been devastated as a result of knife crime. However, I urge the government to tread carefully. Yes, knife crime is a scourge, but if we simply say that we will criminalise more the people who carry knives, what happens is people choose to carry other sharp weapons. So we will need to look closely at the detail of this bill to make sure it achieves what it sets out to, and not just a headline. And the Humble Address also talked about new rules for councils, police, schools and housing associations to work together. Well, the Mayor of London, of course, let's remind ourselves, a Labour Mayor of London, set up the Violence Reduction Unit to do just that. And in Hackney, we have the Integrated Gangs Unit. So once again, and I genuinely and openly offer the government the opportunity to come and see what we're doing locally in Hackney. We haven't got all the answers, but we are tackling this. And unfortunately, from bitter experience of what the impact is on our community. It rather surprised me, Mr. Speaker, to hear Her Majesty talk about setting up a Royal Commission on Justice. I don't think this is really necessary. I could refer the government to a slew of Public Accounts Committee's reports and concerns raised on probation, where we have seen a failure of the modernisation of the probation system and an attempt to reverse those changes. Prisons, where we've seen a slashing of prison officer numbers and huge issues there. Chaos in courts and tribunals, and a huge IT project that is behind schedule. The problem is, several Secretaries of State and Justice were throwing everything in the air, wanting to change everything overnight, and that is a recipe for chaos. What we need is to go back to the basics, to stability, not to have stop-start, not to have reversal, and make sure there is proper investment in our criminal justice system. A Royal Commission worries me. It kicks the can down the road, as there is a danger that we'll never actually deliver. A Royal Commission can take a couple of years, and the government has to consider it. We haven't got that time to wait. Actually, it's much more simple than that, and I hope the government will look at those bits of our work and make sure that it takes those points on board. I was interested in the National Skills Fund, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I hope, hopefully, that this might mean investment for people in low-paid work who want to improve their skills, something the Labour manifesto proposed. If it will end the need of that barrier for skills training and further education, that barrier of a loan, which for many of my constituents, who are women returning to work, who've been in low-paid jobs, had children, and they do not want to take the risk of a loan in order to possibly get a better paid job. They can't afford that. They haven't got the credit record for that, and they're very nervous about that. If the National Skills Fund supports them, fantastic. If the National Skills Fund also makes sure that our young people are training in the tech skills that are global skills that many of my tech businesses in Shoreditch find hard to get in the UK, then great. And as I said from the very beginning, if there is something that the government is doing that will help my constituents, I will work with them on that. But I wait to see the detail. On immigration, I am sadly an expert in the failings of the Home Office in this area, as one of the top 6 customers of the 650 members of this House to the Home Office, representing constituents' concerns. I also represent the world in one borough. People from across the world come to my surgery telling me their problems with immigration, and we have 40,000 European citizens in Hackney. as well as the many Commonwealth citizens. And the hostile environment is in reality in my borough. When leave to remain was reduced from 5 years to 3 years, guess what? That meant 2 fees that constituents had to pay before they could apply for their citizenship. And then, in a very mean-spirited way, it was reduced to 2 years. So you have to pay 3 times the fees before you can qualify for citizenship. And many of my constituents really struggle with those costs. I, of course, want a fair system, a clear system, and a faster system. But we shouldn't be putting up barriers to people who have demonstrably showed that they have a legitimate right to be here and are simply being pushed through a bureaucratic process that delays their eventual proper opportunity to fulfil work and family hopes and contribute to our communities and our economy. The government has talked about investment and borrowing in this Queen's speech in a very simple phrase, and I look forward to seeing the detail. Her Majesty talked about the government keeping borrowing and debt under control and a responsible fiscal strategy. Let me assure the government that if I am returned to the position as chair of the Public Accounts Committee, or indeed even if I'm not, I will hope that that committee watches every penny and pound of taxpayers' money that is being spent. And I will be challenging the government on the efficiency, the effectiveness and the economy of every promise made in this Queen's speech and every plan that emerges from it. But above all, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I will challenge, cajole, criticise and at every stage make sure this government is doing what it can to deliver for the best interests of my constituents in Hackney South and Shoreditch.
Sir John Redwood.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, it was a pleasure at the start of this debate to see our new Speaker in the chair, and I would like through you to send my congratulations to him. I was delighted he was elected, and I'm quite sure he will be a fair and experienced judge of our affairs and will look after our House very well. Mr. Deputy Speaker, the recent election and the conversation I was able to conduct even more intensively than usual with the electors of Wokingham told me that they do want some changes, and I made promises to them that I would come here again as an advocate for more money for our local schools, which have been shortchanged in recent years. And so it is a pleasure in the gracious speech to see the down payments promised for next year, and I look forward to those continuing in the years that follow. And I and my electors agreed that we need more money for our local surgeries and more nurses and doctors to be recruited and better support for our local District General Hospital in Reading. And again, I see that answer already in the gracious speech with the promise of substantial new resources, financial and personnel, for the National Health Service generally. And I see that is going to be laid out in legislation for a 5-year period. So I welcome that. And it is a pleasure to say to my electors 2 parts of the job seem to be well on the way to being done. But having little experience of government, I know that there will remain day by day, month by month issues to sort out to make sure that my constituency gets its fair share of the money. I will give way.
Very grateful to the right honourable gentleman. I was just wondering, in his capacity as former Secretary of State of Wales, that he shares my concern and indeed disappointment that there was no mention of Wales whatsoever in the Queen's speech. And also my concern that this money that is being promised to England, how will that find its way through the Barnett formula or wherever to Wales? And finally, would he perhaps ask the same question as me? How much longer do we need the Wales office for? Because looking at the behaviour of this place, there will be people outside who are begging the question, surely Wales can do a bit better than this.
Well, the Honourable Lady knows full well that there is a formula and consequentials from the English settlement, and so I'm quite sure that my right honourable friends in the government are going to look after Wales, and it is her job to test them out in the appropriate debates. This current speech of mine is not the appropriate moment, because I'm not here to speak for Wales. I'm here to speak for Wokingham and West Berkshire, and I'm here to speak for the wider nation, as we all do. I'm also looking forward to the promises under infrastructure. The government has rightly said we have a big job of work to do to improve our railways and our roads, to make sure that people can get to work and get their children to school, that we can bust the congestion and make sure that people have easier journeys. That too will reduce pollution and will increase safety. And in Wokingham, a very fast-growing area, because we're doing more than our fair share for the national housing achievement, we particularly need support on putting in those additional transport links, the digital signals on the railways so that we can have more capacity and more trains, the improved road network. And it was a pleasure to work with the previous Secretary of State for Transport in the last Parliament on the idea of strategic local highway networks. I felt we needed to have more money and support for those roads that are important but are under the control of the councils, don't qualify for trunk status, can often relieve the trunk roads but also provide very important means for my constituents and others to get to work and get their children to school. And the previous government answered that, but it falls to the new government with the more generous financial settlement I look forward to for us to be able to work together so that I can get some of those road schemes and some of those rail improvements for the Wokingham area, which will be much needed. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I think the big thing that represents a seismic shift in government policy, which I welcome, is the introduction of optimism, the enthusiasm, the belief that this country can achieve great things, the belief that we don't have to constantly cut under the Maastricht criteria and that we should no longer make state debt the main objective of economic policy. I've been working away for some time to try and get this change of policy, but Philip Hammond was not sympathetic to my views in all sorts of ways. I'm delighted that the new Prime Minister and the new Chancellor are enthusiastic about the idea that the aim of economic policy for this Parliament must be prosperity. Prosperity for the many. Tax cuts for everyone. How do you get more prosperity? Tax cuts are a very important part of creating that greater prosperity. People work hard, they want to keep more of their own money. They're often better judges of how to spend their money than councils and governments. And it falls to a renewed Conservative Party to take that message to every part of the country, to implement that message in the forthcoming budget, and to show that not only will we find more money for the schools and the hospitals and the roads as we need, but that we will also have some money for tax cuts. Some tax cuts do pay for themselves because our rates are too high, and if you cut the rate to an affordable rate, people work harder, stay here, contribute more, are more enterprising, you get more money in. Other tax cuts will reduce the revenue, so you need to grow the economy, and over the years it works because growth generates the more jobs, the higher incomes, and incomes the more money. Now, in order to fulfil this new objective, the government has rightly changed the basis on which the economy is going to be governed. And we've gone away from state debt as a percentage of GDP, the iron rule which dominated the last dreadful years of the Labour government, a period of collapse when the state debt got out of control, dominated the coalition period of recovery, dominated the Philip Hammond Conservative government period when he seemed to like that particular proposition. And now we've got a much more sensible idea that we should, of course, be prudent. There is no magic money tree. We can't spend on the scale Labour recommended to the country safely. So what we were suggesting now as the golden rule is that any current expenditure must be covered out of taxation, but we can borrow up to 3% of GDP in order to put in those big new investments and a myriad of smaller investments we need in broadband and in rail and in road and in water and the other things where public money is needed as an adjunct to the substantial private investment in many cases which will be going into those important developments. And this will make a lot of difference, because what this Parliament needs to understand is there has been a very nasty world manufacturing recession over the last 6 months or so, and there has been a worrying slowdown in the world economy over the last year. And it began, as these things always do, with central banks who get it wrong. And it began with the tightening of the central bank in America, the Federal Reserve Board, in the third and fourth quarters of 2018. And you could feel the shake on the world economy, and you saw what was happening to world markets. And it spread to the Eurozone, where they stopped all their quantitative easing, although their economy was still very weak and couldn't really take that particular shock. And it came to the United Kingdom, where we had a very severe policy being pursued by the Bank of England. And very predictably, I remember warning about it some time ago, These changes in central bank policy did indeed slow the world economy. Now things have changed, but they haven't changed yet in the United Kingdom. So I urge the Prime Minister and the Chancellor to get the UK authorities into line with the analysis and with the prescription of the world's central banks outside the United Kingdom. Because what we've seen in the last 6 months is a very big move to cut interest rates worldwide by most of the major central banks, not only in the advanced world, but also even more dramatically in quite a number of the emerging market countries, from Turkey to India and Brazil. And we've seen cuts in the United States of America. We've seen the reintroduction of quantitative easing, bond buying, created money in the Eurozone, because the Eurozone economy has shuddered to a halt in some places. We've seen further developments in Japan, who carried on with quantitative easing and zero and negative interest rates throughout the difficult period, but they too need to boost things rather more. But there has been no response in the United Kingdom. Indeed, only in the last few days, the Bank of England has gone the other way. And it had a series of stress tests on our major banks. Delighted to say our major banks passed with flying colours. The worst case in the stress test was very severe. There were no problems for the banks, as the Bank of England reported. But the Bank of England then said the clearing banks have to double the countercyclical buffer of capital they keep. Technical language, what does it mean? It means about 20 billion less money available for mortgages and car loans and business expansion and new investment. That's what it means. It means a very fundamental monetary tightening. It happened at the same time as sterling went up about 10%, another very strong monetary tightening. Money growth is eye-wateringly low in the United Kingdom, unlike the Eurozone, and well below that in the United States of America. And at exactly the point when we were doing this, the Federal Reserve Board, with 2% plus growth in America, which we would love to have on this side of the Atlantic, was injecting billions. I think it was about $150 billion injected in a single month into the money markets in order to keep things liquid, so that the American consumer, the car buyer, the mortgage demander, and the small businesses would have access to the money they needed to continue the very successful American growth strategy. So let us make sure we have a growth strategy where the monetary policy is not standing on the brake too much. But there is also the issue of how the Treasury has been recalculating at official level our obligations. And it was very noticeable that around October, when probably they thought we might be leaving the European Union, because there was a chance of that at the time, they decided that actually the student loan system was costing us $12 billion a year more, which hadn't been accounted for in that way up to that point. And there are absolutely no changes in the student loan system, and there were no changes in the experience of those who couldn't repay their loans. But this meant that the figures we present deteriorated very sharply as a result of this particular figure. And I don't think we should allow that to deviate from what I hope is going to be a very positive budget, probably at the end of next month, from the rumours I see in the press, because we do need that budget to provide that boost to growth. I think it is eminently affordable to have the increases that we are promising and have been talking about in the general election, in schools and hospitals and infrastructure, and eminently affordable to have those tax cut promises that have been made on business rates and on national insurance, and we would not need to offset that with other tax increases, because this economy desperately needs a boost. So in a world where some other governments are boosting on the fiscal side, and in a world where practically every other country is boosting on the monetary side, to see off the threat of the world slowdown turning into something worse, it is very important that the United Kingdom authorities do the same thing. Now, I have every confidence in my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, and I think he is single-handedly turning around the mood with his message of confidence and enthusiasm for how we can do better. But it is going to take some cash. Now is the time to spend a bit of that cash. This country can achieve a lot more. The economy can do a lot more. So let's make sure that that new message of prosperity for the many and tax cuts for everyone is seen through, because that is the way to bring most people in this country together. That is the way to honour the promises many of us have made in the general election. That is to show that the country has made wise decisions up to this point, That is the way to show that Brexit would not be damaging our economy. It can be part of a positive move towards faster growth, better jobs, more paid jobs, just as we have been experiencing in recent years and months.
Sir Edward Davey.
Speaker, it's a great privilege to follow the right honourable gentleman, the member for Wokingham, and it's a delight to hear him be a convert, however late, to increased public spending. But he made some very interesting points about macroeconomic policy, Mr Deputy Speaker. He talked about the new fiscal rule that the Chancellor announced just before the general election, which I hope this House will soon get to debate. He welcomed it. I have some concerns about it. I think it's actually rather old-fashioned. I would like to see a new fiscal rule where we look at the net worth of the public sector to ensure that is growing over time. At the moment it's in negative territory because of particularly because of various pension fund liabilities. But it would be a much better approach to managing fiscal policy long term because it looks at the whole balance sheet of the public sector, which is what a normal business would do, and we now have the data, as is now a data set for the last 3 years from the ONS. So I hope we can have that debate later on, because I think it's very important that we do get fiscal policy right. And the honourable gentleman also made two very other interesting points on monetary policy. He talked about quantitative easing, wanting to bring that back. That's an interesting question. Oh, he shakes his head. Sorry if I misinterpret him. But we should look at quantitative easing and how it is done, whether in this country or elsewhere, because there's concern the way quantitative easing is being done by central banks has not actually led to a fair distribution of the prosperity, but the money has gone into a small number of hands, actually resulting in increased inequality. And I also think, I'm slightly worried by something he said on monetary policy, which may have implied, he may disagree that that was his implication, that there should be some challenge to the independence of the central bank by the government of the day. I would not welcome that, while I would certainly welcome a debate about quantitative easing. I look forward to debates with the right honourable gentleman so we get our macroeconomic policy right. I would just finally say this, Mr Deputy Speaker. It did appear that the right honourable gentleman was talking about expansionary fiscal policy and expansionary monetary policy. I wonder if he's worried about the impact of Brexit on our economy. Mr Deputy Speaker, like the Leader of the Opposition, I would like to remember one of our late friends, Frank Dobson, who passed away last month. Although we were members of different political parties, I found Frank one of the friendliest, most decent, most committed members of this House I've ever met in my 20 years here. From his opposition to the Iraq War and apartheid, from the work he did to rebuild the NHS, Frank leaves a proud record. And in his role as the Brian Blessed of the Commons, Frank also leaves several volumes of funny, filthy, and totally politically incorrect jokes. Mr. Speaker, I'm sure you would like to hear an example, but I fear I must remind the House that our proceedings are being broadcast before the 9 p.m. watershed. But can I pay tribute to the move and seconder of the humble address? The honourable member for Chatham and Aylesford, I do think, has a bright career in front of her, particularly in pantomime. I'd like to invite her to join me in my annual walk-on part at St Paul's Players in Chessington. This year, during the general election, I took my family there and I had my walk-on part as one of the merry men of Robin Hood. And I can tell you, Mr Deputy Speaker, I know where the baddies are in this House and they're where the Sheriff of Nottingham sits. The honourable member for Walsall North did an impressively long speech as a bid for a job ahead of the Prime Minister's ministerial reshuffle. I wish him luck. Mr Deputy Speaker, I believe our United Kingdom is one of the greatest examples of international cooperation in world history. So much so that 4 nations can be as one while being themselves. Democratic, open and internationalist, operating under the rule of law and under the uniting presence of Her Majesty. We have been a beacon of political stability in the world. I believe we remain fundamentally a people who are outward-looking, inclusive and compassionate, capable of progressive reform as we recognise and value the lessons of history.
On that point, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. I wonder if he agrees with me that while the SNP might trumpet their 80 seats, the fact that only 45% of the people in Scotland voted for them, and that if we had a more proportional representation system, that would have been reflected in the seats there in the same way as the seats here might have been a little different.
My honourable friend is exactly right. The majority of people in Scotland voted for parties who wanted to preserve the Union. Although, as I get a sense from members and right honourable members opposite, I would also note the majority of people voted for parties who wanted to give the people the final say on the European Union. Mr. Speaker, we needed a Queen's speech that would truly keep our country together, heal the divides, and tackle the challenges of inequality, lack of opportunity, and of climate change. But I fear this Prime Minister's Queen's speech will only undermine our united country's great traditions. I fear we'll become a more inward-looking, more illiberal and less compassionate country with this programme of this government. The one nation rhetoric of the Prime Minister is not matched by his actions. Let me start with Brexit. And let's be clear, the Prime Minister and the Conservative Party now own Brexit. It is their total and complete responsibility. They can't blame anyone else anymore. They have become the Brexit party from top to bottom. And the question, of course, is this. Will the Prime Minister get Brexit done? More precisely, will he get it done by the end of the year so we can avoid the disaster of a no-deal Brexit? Well, we shall see. The Prime Minister's biggest weapon in his Brexit deal endeavour is surely his unmatched flexibility with the truth. His so-called triumph of achieving a deal for Brexit Phase 1 was only possible because he betrayed his big promise to the DUP, his erstwhile big supporters. And, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the Prime Minister's willingness to jump unashamedly over every red line he had previously been willing to die in the ditch for will have been noted in Brussels by Europe's rather more skillful negotiators. Some of us are happy to win.
I thank the Right Honourable Member for giving way. Would he agree with me that he makes a fairly accurate point about the assessment of the communication between the Conservative Party, its leader, and my party? But would he agree also that there is still opportunity and time for redemption?
There is always time for redemption, Mr. Deputy Speaker. But I have to say to the honourable gentleman that if he's hoping for it in this case from this Prime Minister, I wish him well. Some of us, Mr. Deputy Speaker, have led successful negotiations pan-Europe in Brussels, difficult negotiations, which I won for Britain, on everything from economic reform, the single market, to climate change. I didn't succeed by adopting this Prime Minister's tactics of bulldog bluster combined with the record of a turncoat. I don't believe this is a right approach, and I don't believe he'll succeed without reneging on almost all of his previous promises to leave voters. And my parliamentary interest in this, Mr. Deputy Speaker, is whether or not, in the dark Conservative forests of the Brexit Spartans, his erstwhile friends have yet smelt betrayal. We shall see. But as we oppose Brexit and continue to point out the extra costs, the economic damage and the loss of influence, we will also remind colleagues opposite of the previously unthinkable concessions that now need to be conceded for any chance of a deal next year. I now turn to the NHS, which the Prime Minister has made so much of. Every member of this House was elected on a manifesto committed to increasing spending on the NHS in real terms. Maybe there's a little political consensus there. And I, for one, am relaxed about putting a spending commitment for the health service into law. But, Mr. Deputy Speaker, this begs one question. Is the spending enough? Now, I don't want to repeat the election debate where the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats were arguing for higher health spending than the government. Let me instead approach it in a rather different way, in terms of what our medium-term NHS spending target should be. Most health analysts tend to talk, not as the Prime Minister does, in the abstract, just in total spending, which is bound to go up with an ageing population and economic growth. They tend to talk in comparisons between similar countries, on spending per person, on a percentage of the national income. And if we compare the UK's health spending in these ways, even with the Prime Minister's rises, then when we compare ourselves against the world's other largest developed countries, the UK fares badly. In the G7, our health spending per person is the second lowest, lower than Germany, lower than France. And as a share of national income in the G7, the UK again performs badly, with Italy the only country spending less. Now, I readily admit the NHS is far more efficient as a health service than, say, the health systems in the United States. But surely we should be really ambitious for the NHS. And the factual evidence shows that this government and this Queen's speech is not. So as we legislate for future NHS spending targets, why don't we take the opportunity to be really ambitious? Why don't we aim to spend 10% of our national income on the NHS as a minimum? That would bring us up to G7 comparators. And I think the British people would back a policy where £1 in every 10 of the national cake was spent on the nation's health. Now, Mr. Speaker, I accept this government may be nervous about spending targets based on national income, because their economic policies look set to fail so badly and national income will grow very slowly. I worry... I give way to the gentleman.
I'm very grateful. Would he not accept that if he's trying to compare a health service which is completely free to the user and one where there are payments through insurance schemes and collections of money, is not a fair comparison? So he should add in all the costs of the inland revenue in the UK, because that's the way we collect the revenue. And in relation to a previous point you made, no, I think Brexit is good for the economy, not bad. I've always said that.
Well, I'll come to that last point in a second, but on his point about health systems, it's an interesting point for debate. But I would point to countries, say, like Denmark, who have a taxpayer-funded system, and they spend a significantly higher share of their national income on health. So I'm afraid the point isn't validly made. No, I'm going to make some progress. And on economic policy and Brexit, I have to tell the House I'm worried about Brexit austerity, self-imposed Brexit austerity, and I'll explain why. First of all, take the damage to growth from Brexit and the red tape of Brexit at our customs borders, a cost estimated by Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs at a mere £15 billion every year. We had a red tape battle in the coalition. We never got rid of anywhere near that amount of money, yet this government wants to impose it on our businesses. Then we have the damage to the businesses and our NHS from the ending of free movement of labour within the EU. That will damage growth overnight. And this Brexit austerity, it's not just the impact on our economic growth that worries me, but it's the impact on the poorest and the most vulnerable in our society who will feel it the most. We've already seen the numbers of children living in poverty rise by nearly 400,000 since 2015. And we've seen the report from the Resolution Foundation, and I hope members opposite will read it. It analysed the Conservatives' general election manifesto, and the Resolution Foundation said that child poverty will continue to rise year on year with that party's policies.
On this point, I thank my honourable member for giving way. 135,000 children will live in temporary accommodation this Christmas. And this government makes no proposal how actually resolve the tragedy of temporary accommodation, which is a childhood trauma, and will only be resolved if we build a lot more social homes for rent.
I couldn't agree more with my honourable friend, Mr. Deputy Speaker. Shelter's report made that very point this week, and there was no mention of homeless people in the Queen's speech. There was no mention of tackling child poverty. And there was another huge omission from the Queen's speech, Mr. Deputy Speaker, the climate emergency. Sure, we heard the unambitious 2050 net zero target mentioned again, but just like the Conservative manifesto, there was a lack of a sense of urgency and a lack of a set of practical but radical measures, and I find that truly alarming. And it's particularly alarming because this Prime Minister has previously written so scathingly about the need to tackle climate change.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for giving way, and he will know, as a former Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change, how long it takes to get these major projects that will deliver big change up and running. I outlined in my speech 3 big failures because of this government and its predecessor. Does he not agree that we need to get action going now?
I absolutely do, and she mentioned in her speech carbon capture and storage. I had pushed that competition forward. It was going very well. But directly after the 2015 election, the then Chancellor cancelled it overnight and put back Britain's global leadership on this key climate change technology back years. It was a disgraceful measure. But I was talking about the opinions of the Prime Minister on climate change. Just 7 years ago, Mr. Deputy Speaker, in his infamous Telegraph column, he sought to cast doubt on mainstream climate science, dismissing it as complete tosh. You can hear him saying that, can't you? And instead he warned about, and I quote, the encroachment of a mini ice age. The encroachment of a mini ice age. That was what our Prime Minister said. And on wind power, where Britain now leads the world thanks to Liberal Democrat ministers, what did this Prime Minister have to say about what is now the cheapest form of renewable power? If anybody wants to contest that point, I'm happy to take an intervention. None coming. What the Prime Minister said about wind farms was this. He said wind farms would barely pull the skin off a rice pudding. Barely pull the skin off a rice pudding. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this technology is a global leading technology in Britain. It is powering our homes, but the Prime Minister apparently doesn't believe in it. And then we see the Conservative record since 2015 on climate change, voted for at every stage by this Prime Minister. Scrapping the zero carbon homes regulation, banning onshore wind, stopping tidal glooms. And then we come to Heathrow. In South West London, we don't forget what the Prime Minister said just 4 years ago. He promised he would lie down in front of those bulldozers and stop the building, stop the construction of that 3rd runway. If only, Mr. Speaker, Deputy Speaker, if only.
Give way. Mr. Deputy Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for giving away. Would he not agree with me that this Conservative government's commitment to expanding Heathrow and the economic benefits claimed for it do not justify the impact on climate change, the impact on air quality and the impact on noise in South West London in particular, but over a very wide area?
My honourable friend is absolutely right. She has been an amazing campaigner against the 3rd runway, and I always admire her advice and thank her for it. So, Mr. Deputy Speaker, when we say on these benches that we don't trust this Prime Minister and this government on climate change, the evidence is with us. So we will be raising the need for radical action on climate change time and again in this Parliament. We will work to force the government to make the next global climate change talks in Glasgow in November a success, even though they come, ironically, just at the same time as the UK will be losing its influence on climate change at the European table. Mr. Deputy Speaker, we will champion the need for decarbonising capitalism, to build on the fantastic work done by the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney. Just today in the Financial Times, Mr. Carney is taking action, introducing world-lead stress tests, climate stress tests, on major financial institutions. If only this government would back and support the Bank of England in the city, there is a historic opportunity for this country to lead the world with the gold standard for green finance. But I fear there's no ambition on the Conservative benches for that. Mr. Deputy Speaker, this Queen's speech is disappointing on so many levels, and we will be voting against it. And Liberal Democrats in this Parliament will do our democratic duty to scrutinise this government and argue for the liberal, inclusive, fairer and greener society we believe in.
Greg Clark.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the Right Honourable Gentleman, who in his parade of greatest hits somehow forgot to mention that the achievements that he described were under a Conservative-led government. But it's nice to know that he regards them as successes. It's a great pleasure to see a fellow Kent MP in the chair, Sir Roger, and I congratulate you on your position in taking the chair today. Throughout the Prime Minister's speech, on the gracious speech, he referred consistently to one nation. And it is right that he did so, because what we have experienced in the last week is something extraordinary. In towns, villages and cities in every part of our country, individual men and women resolved quietly but together to move on, not only from the divisions of the last 3.5 years, but in many cases differences that have endured for decades. A coming together of the nation in a spirit of quiet pragmatism and a determination to progress, rejecting both an attempt to divide our nation by leave and remain, and rejecting also an attempt to impose an extreme and ideological doctrine on a moderate and flexible people. I've never been more proud than to swear the oath of allegiance to Her Majesty and by extension to our country than I was earlier this week. The spirit of national cohesion, of one nation, means so much to me because of the course of my own life. My constituency of Tunbridge Wells is a beautiful and famous place, as you know, Mr Deputy Speaker. Famous for being home to people of strong views, who are given to express them robustly and confidently, and I wouldn't have it any other way. But famous too for a civility and courtesy that makes even going door to door during a winter election campaign a warm and convivial experience. I enjoyed it enormously. Tunbridge Wells has always chosen a Conservative Member of Parliament. But it would be a fatal error to assume that this is automatic and that support can be taken for granted. Tunbridge Wells is an articulate, a discerning and a demanding place. People work very hard. They live prudently rather than lavishly. And many face tough challenges that belie our reputation as a place of uniform affluence. Tunbridge Wells has elected Conservatives, in part at least, because it has experienced good, effective Conservative representation, whether from my predecessors, Sir Patrick Mayhew and Archie Norman, and I hope myself, Kent County Council, led by effective public servants like Sir Sandy Bruce Lockhart and Paul Carter, and a borough council that has regularly offered some of the best facilities and services, offering some of the best value in the country. I was born at the other end of the country, in Middlesbrough, and went to comprehensive school in Southbank, in the constituency of my honourable friend, the new Member of Parliament for Redcar. My early training in canvassing, Mr Deputy Speaker, was going door to door on Thursday and Friday nights round the estates collecting the milk money for my father and grandfather, who were local milkmen. And during those years, it was impossible to imagine that Southbank, Eston and Normanby would return a Conservative Member of Parliament. The dividing lines of two nations seemed to be impregnable. I think one of the reasons for that was people's lack of experience of Conservative administration at a local level. But that was made a thing of the past through the election and the record in office of Ben Houchin as the Mayor of the Tees Valley. And I'm proud that as Minister for Cities and later as Secretary of State for Communities and Local Government, I brought up the concept of city deals, which became growth deals, and then the devolution deals. The first time in 100 years in which the flow of power was away from Whitehall and towards our great towns and cities. Negotiating the Tees Valley devolution deal, which established the mayoralty and devolved funding and decision-making from the banks of the Thames to the banks of the Tees, was a big moment. It's meant that every Teessider has experienced what a dedicated, effective Conservative mayor has done. I believe it's paved the way for the strong representation of Tees Valley MPs that now sit on these benches. The same is true for the West Midlands, a place that's become close to my heart through my work with manufacturing industry. I negotiated the devolution deal that led to Andy Street being elected mayor for that great region. With energy, tenacity and intellect, Andy has shown to everyone in that region, again, what Conservative administration can deliver. Now, it would not be right nor fair to my honourable friends to say that without Ben Houchin, we wouldn't have Jacob Young and Peter Gibson in the Tees Valley, and that without Andy Street, we wouldn't have Nicola Richards and Sean Bailey in West Bromwich. Their mandate is their own, and we are proud of their achievements. But I do know that my honourable friends would agree that it was an enormous help to have this experience of effective Conservative administration. And that's why I so commend the commitment in the Queen's speech to give communities even greater control over how investment is spent so that they can decide what is best for them, just as my right honourable friend did when he was Mayor of London, and a very distinguished one indeed. The truth, Mr Deputy Speaker, is that the people of Tunbridge Wells and the people of Teesside do not belong to different nations, for all the assumptions over the years that this was so. They are all of one nation. They believe identically in working hard in order to get on, in taking pride in our country and its history, which is not in conflict with knowing that we need to do new things well in order to advance. They're straightforward enough to know that things have to be earned and paid for rather than conjured from the air. They will pay their taxes, but want them to be used responsibly on useful things and not squandered. They're practical men and women, suspicious of ideology and dogma. And when they elect people to office, they expect them to do what they promise and to see concrete results. From Tunbridge Wells to Teesside, they're the same people, part of the same nation, one nation, our United Kingdom. And I'm proud that this party is now indisputably their champion and their choice.
Sammy Wilson. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Can I first of all congratulate the Government on its win in this election. And I think that for many people across the United Kingdom, the kind of Queen's speech we could have had today would have been vastly different. Probably a programme for bankruptcy rather than a programme for a brighter future for the United Kingdom. And I think that it is significant that right across the United Kingdom, people who would normally have voted for other parties decided that they weren't taken in by the Leader of the Opposition wrapping himself in his big red coat, promising all kinds of Christmas presents, because they knew that if they voted for that, they'd be paying for Christmas for years in the future. And so I think that it is important that we do have a government which has promised to deliver sensible arrangements for services across the United Kingdom, sensible economic growth, while at the same time recognising that one of the major things that people in this country wanted was a delivery on the promise that there was a referendum to leave the European Union, and that had to be delivered on. I'll come back to that issue in a moment or two, because I don't believe that the approach which the Government is taking fully fulfils that commitment, and there are things which we as a party want to see the Government changing in the next year. But let me just say that we do welcome many of the commitments which are made. I know from the campaign which I had around the doors in East Antrim, one of the major things which came up time and time again was the state of our health service. And with the growing demands on the health service, with the greater possibilities which there now are for treatments which didn't exist in the past, and with the higher standards which people expect, there are increasing demands on the resources for the health service. And the commitment which we have from the Government to put more money into the health service, something, and I know that there have been complaints, there was no mention of Wales in this. Well, of course, Northern Ireland, like Wales and like Scotland, will benefit from these decisions, because there will be barnet consequences for devolved administrations to spend on. I also welcome the promise of infrastructure developments, and I look forward to the Prime Minister delivering on the comment which he made to my honourable colleague from North Antrim, when he talked about linking physically Northern Ireland to the UK, to the GB mainland, through a bridge. He said, watch this space. We'll be watching this space. We expect the space between Scotland and Northern Ireland to be filled at some stage in the future with a physical link. Because, of course, physical links and major infrastructure projects like this all over the world are judged not only on their economic benefit, but also on their political benefit, how they integrate countries. And indeed, if one looks at the arguments for HS2, integrating the north of England with the south of England, it's as much a political project as it is an economic project. Yes, we'll give way.
My honourable friend mentioned Wales and infrastructure. It is the case that Wales has got 5% of the population, 11% of the rail track, and 1.5% of the rail investment. And we don't benefit from HS2, and we would look to have a consequential from that. Would you agree with me this isn't a fair system, and Wales does need more in that sense?
Well, of course, with all national infrastructure projects, and I'm pleased to see, for example, when it comes to even infrastructure projects such as the third runway at Heathrow, there's a commitment to making sure that some of the benefits of that are spilled out across the across the rest of the United Kingdom through various Heathrow hub projects, for example, which I hope Northern Ireland will benefit from. So there are ways of dispersing even the expenditure on those major projects, although they don't physically run through some parts of the United Kingdom. I think that, especially in Northern Ireland, the commitment to the application of the Armed Covenant is very important, given the number of people that we have in Northern Ireland who served through the Troubles, tens of thousands who are now still living with the consequences and who don't have access to services on the same basis as other parts of the United Kingdom. We look forward to the commitment on that, and also on the promises that the legacy issues will be dealt with, so that we don't find soldiers being dragged through the courts for things which happened 40 years ago, while incidentally terrorists walk free as a result of arrangements which were made by the Labour Party during the negotiations on the Belfast Agreement. Other issues which we are happy with and give support to is the benefits which high streets will have from business rates. And I've seen the devastation that high rates have done to businesses across my own constituency and town centres. And business rates relief are, of course, only one part of the solution to the changing retail environment that we have right across the United Kingdom. And, of course, promoting business through tax incentives for research and development, for training, for opening up new markets. That will be especially important as we look to the wider global benefits that we take when we leave the EU and can do our own trade deals. Those are the things which I find we can give our support to in this agreement. But throughout the Prime Minister's speech, and indeed many of the speeches which have been made here today, people have talked about the government party being a one-nation party. But if we're going to talk about a one-nation party, then it must not just be one nation in terms of trying to deal with and bring forward policies that affect all the kind of social layers in the economy and in the country. It also has to be, and also has to extend to all the parts of the United Kingdom. If the Conservative Party says it wants to be, and the government says it wants to be the party of the Union, and I noted what the Minister said, he would not allow anyone to rip up the UK, one of the most successful political unions. And yet, Mr Deputy Speaker, I've got to say that one of the very first things mentioned in the Queen's speech is the pushing through of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. And the content of that bill will, in effect, leave Northern Ireland behind the frontier, the customs frontier of the EU, leaving us outside the UK customs arrangements and inside the EU customs arrangement. In effect, the European boundary when it comes to trade, when it comes to the economy, will be extended around the outside of Northern Ireland, with all of the kind of economic consequences that will have for businesses in Northern Ireland, whether it's increased costs, whether it's delay in goods being going through customs arrangements, whether it's extra bureaucracy, and of course it will also affect trade coming from Northern Ireland into our biggest market in GB. And that's only the immediate economic consequences. And then, of course, there are long-term political consequences.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Would he agree with me that as the government now proceed in the course of 2020 to go through with getting Brexit done, which many people will be content with, the bigger picture beyond that will be the unity of the United Kingdom and the increased prosperity that has to flow, that the Prime Minister alluded to, not just to the south east of England, but to all of the United Kingdom?
And of course, that's the other argument, not just that he wouldn't allow the UK to be ripped up, but he wanted to extend the prosperity of the UK to every part. I understand in Northern Ireland there are many people who will never share the view of the Union which I and my party have. They may not look at it from a cultural or historical point of view, but they do understand the importance of being part of the 5th biggest economy in the world. They understand the value of that, how it benefits them economically, how it shelters them from the economic storms which from time to time affect the world economy. We would not have survived the banking crisis, for example, had we not been part of the United Kingdom. It's significant that some of those who aspire to United Ireland turn a blind eye to the fact that the Irish government had to seek a multi-billion-pound loan from the United Kingdom because they couldn't survive the economic storm of the world banking crisis. So there are huge economic benefits for being part of the United Kingdom. And that just does not apply to Northern Ireland. It also applies to Scotland. And I know that the Scottish National Party, because of their electoral success, are now pushing for a second referendum. They say it's because the situation has changed. Well, ironically, of course, the situation has changed since they had the last once-in-a-generation referendum. They have now fewer MPs than they had then. They have a lower share of the vote than they had then. What has changed is that there is less support from 2015 than there is today. So, if anything, this agitation for another referendum is not based on the views which have been expressed democratically by the people of Scotland. But in the absence, I believe that it is right that there should not be continual referendums offered year after year just because a party claims that its electoral fortunes have gone up a little or down a little. Otherwise, you could have demands after every series of elections. The important thing now is for this government to sell the benefits of the Union right across the United, to act in a way where people see that there are benefits in the Union, to when they have acted to talk up what they have done. And I know this from having been a minister in the Northern Ireland Executive. The tendency of devolved administrations, it doesn't matter whether you're a unionist in it or an nationalist in it, is all the good things you claim that have come because of what? the devolved assembly has done. All the bad things that happen are because of what Westminster has done. If we're going to spend more money on projects which benefit the whole of the United Kingdom, if we're going to put more money into the health service, if more money is going to go into education, then let's make it quite clear, and ministers should be going out across the United Kingdom selling that this has happened because of decisions made in London, where the centre of government rests for the United Kingdom. Let's go out, let's be bold in selling the union. And before, of course, the government can do that, I believe that it must address the issue of what its current agreement is going to do to Northern Ireland. It can't claim to be a unionist party and cut Northern Ireland off. I will, yes.
Mr Deputy Speaker, I thank my right honourable friend for giving way, and he's coming to the heart of the matter for us. And I agree with him that the union is absolutely crucial. But many of the issues that need to be addressed to mitigate the impact of the consequences of the withdrawal agreement are internal to the United Kingdom. And there are measures that the government can take to mitigate the impact on the Northern Ireland economy and Northern Ireland business. And what we're seeking from the government is a commitment to do that so that it benefits the whole of the United Kingdom.
Mr Deputy Speaker, and my colleague's right. We've got another year before we have finally settled our relationship with the EU. And I would say to the government, if it really does want to live up to its commitment to be a one-nation party, to refusing to have the United Kingdom ripped up, to wanting to see the United Kingdom prosper as a whole and not part of it being left as an economic backwater because it's cut off from its main market in GB, then an opportunity has to be taken with the stronger negotiating position which it has. I would say to the Prime Minister, use your parliamentary majority. Use the fact that you're no longer, and Europe can no longer rely on the government of the United Kingdom being undermined by actions in this House and by decisions in this House. Get changes made which ensure that we leave the United Kingdom, or the EU, that we get Brexit done, and we get it done for the whole of the United Kingdom.
Sir David Amess. I rise to speak in support of the gracious address, and I want to begin by congratulating the proposer and seconder of the speech. It's obviously a huge honour when you get chosen for those two positions, and I thought my honourable friend, the member for Chatham and Aylesford, who is a very popular colleague, didn't disappoint the House at all. I thought she made a first-class speech. And our honourable friend, the member for Walsall North, I thought it was an absolute tour de force, delivered with no notes at all, and kept us very well entertained. Now, Mr. Acting Deputy Speaker, last night someone said to me, David, you've been here a long time. You must be near to becoming the father of the House. So I looked up the list of seniority to find that I am number 7. And it left me depressed because, first of all, I thought, well, I'm a little bit too young to be father to the House. But I want to make it absolutely abundantly clear that I am the father of 5 children, and the idea that I would want to be father to another 649 others, frankly, is too much. But I then want to comment on the general election campaign, because unlike my right honourable friend, the member for Tunbridge Wells, I hated every minute of it. I'm sorry, I did. I did not want an election to take place 2 weeks before Christmas. I did over 100 canvassing sessions in the wet and the cold, and at night tripping up steps, having a handkerchief in one hand because cold and all the rest of it I found depressing. I am obviously thrilled to bits with the result. But when I think of the detail of the campaign, it seemed that certainly in my constituency, the manufacturers of grey paint must have run out of supplies. Every other house was grey. And then as you were pressing the bells, the purple thing kept going round and round, and then I found myself talking to people who weren't in their houses. So I say to all members, from my point of view, it was a huge risk holding a general election when we did. I had no idea that the British people would turn out in such great numbers, but it is, from the Conservative point of view, a fantastic result. And now I turn to the members on the benches opposite. The smaller parties probably got mixed results, and I don't know what sort of take they have on it, but I entirely understand that the SNP in particular must be very, very happy with the result that they achieve. And I don't know what their strategy will be throughout the next 5 years, because I do recall when they had a lot of members before, they sort of energised the place, and there was a lot of robust debates going on, and I just hope that the SNP will achieve something over the next 5 years, even though they may be disappointed about what is their overall objective. And then I look at the Labour benches, and if you're a new member, obviously you're thrilled to bits at winning your seat. But I think for those of us who have been members already, we do tend to think of the human side of it all, and that includes some of our own colleagues who lost their seat. And as far as the Labour benches were concerned, I think they lost some very, very good colleagues indeed. And I just hope, I mean, the Labour Party, I'm not going to get involved in the internal discussions that are being held at the moment, but I just hope those colleagues who lost their seats will be given as much support as they possibly can and just aren't abandoned. And then I turn to our benches. And I do remember, as you do, Sir Roger, the day that we were elected in 1983. And you and I can remember the joy of that election. And it's a huge thrill and a huge honour, whether you've got your mum and dad there, family and friends, to be sworn in and to make your maiden speech. And I've been looking at the figures of that election, Sir Roger. 397 Conservatives were elected, and Labour was down to 209. We had a majority of 144. Fast forwarding it to last Thursday, we now have a majority of 80, 365 Conservative MPs, Labour 203, and as I said, an overall majority of 80. But although there aren't too many of my new colleagues here to listen to what I'm going to say, I hope they will read Hansard and just reflect on what happened. I became, Sir Roger, famous for 30 seconds in 1992 when I retained the Basildon seat for the third time. And we had a huge election victory. 5 years later, or 14 years after you and I were elected, we suffered an absolutely catastrophic defeat. Labour got 418 seats. The Conservatives were down to 165. Sir Michael Shersby, who was then the Member of Parliament for the constituency that the Prime Minister operates, he died a week after the general election. We were down to 164. So I say to my colleagues and to anyone who's interested, there's no good the Conservative Party winning an election and being the government again after a miserable 2.5 years unless we do something with our majority. There's no point time serving. It's now up to the Conservatives to deliver on the manifesto. And I'm not going to reiterate what was in the manifesto because probably we're all sick to death of it all. But it's now up to the Conservative Party, who have a wonderful opportunity to make sure that every part of the country who has elected a new Conservative Member of Parliament enjoys the prosperity which, if we deliver on this manifesto, then their constituents will also enjoy. What is the point of being in politics for the sake of it? It's to get things done. And for the last 3.5 years, we've got nothing done. We've argued with each other. There's been a horrible atmosphere in this place, falling out with one another. So it's now down to my colleagues on this side to get on and deliver on the manifesto. And although there aren't many newly elected MPs to listen to this, I'm going to give them a bit of advice. Be very careful who you trust. Be wary of the colleague who doesn't give you eye contact but only wants to know you when they want something. And be very wary of your ambitions. Now, I know my own limitations. My wife reminds me of them every single day. We can't all be Prime Minister. And I've been covering up my disappointment for 36 years in not being Prime Minister. Don't be in a hurry to get ministerial office. There's plenty of other things that you can do in this place. And as far as ministers are concerned, and we've got a splendid lot of ministers, once you're on the ladder and you get to the top, there's only one way you're going, I'm afraid. And we're here for 5 years, and there's an awful lot that we can do. So, the manifesto, I agree with every part of it. And the only 2 points that I'm going to pull out is the point about building regulations. I'm very honoured to be the chairman of the all-party parliamentary group for fire safety. If we'd have been listened to, the Grenfell disaster would never have happened. That is the reality. There's a sentence in here about it. We've got to do something with the building regulations. We've got to make sure that every new school that is built, there are sprinklers in it, and we've got to retrospectively fit sprinklers in high-rise blocks. That's got to be delivered. And animal welfare. When I first joined here, I think if I look at my friend in the chair at the moment, we were one of the 4 or 5 Conservatives who voted against fox hunting. Well, there's been a sea change on this side of the House, and we mustn't let the animal kingdom down. Because if I didn't have the support of every constituent in Southend West, I had the support of every dog. I had Dog of the Day on my Twitter account. And I'm not going to let the animal kingdom down. And I hope that on a cross-party basis, we can do something to stop the live exports of animals. We've got to do that. And the final measure, 5 years, anything can happen, social care. Now, we said whether we're going to have a royal commission or what we're going to do, we've got to tackle this issue. And as I say to my constituents who say, David, we're all growing older. Well, you're either growing older or you're dead now. Which way do you want it? And the fact that we're growing older, we've got to do something in terms of social care. So, I end with these thoughts. For many colleagues, the election is over. So what are you going to do for the next 5 years? Well, I'm already going to be involved in an election, because when we get back in January, there are 2 vacancies for Deputy Speaker on the Conservative side, and I will be one of the candidates, and I will be asking colleagues for their first preference vote. And then, when we get Brexit done, there's something else we've got to get done. And that makes Southend-on-Sea a city. Let's get it done. I wish everyone a very happy Christmas and a wonderful New Year.
Order. Just before we proceed, can I at this point remind the House that the convention is that maiden speeches are heard uninterrupted. And the reason I'm saying that now is because it now gives me great pleasure to call the first maiden speaker of the 2019 Parliament, the member for Foyle, Mr. Colm Eastwood.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. No pressure then. As the leader of the SDLP, can I thank the people of Foyle and Belfast South for the resounding mandates that they have given my colleague and I. We will not let you down, and we will not take your support for granted. I also want to thank my predecessor for the work that she did in the constituency. I stand here, Mr Deputy Speaker, as an Irish nationalist. In fact, I stand here because I'm an Irish nationalist, not in spite of it. Because I believe that every single person in all of our constituencies need to be properly and fully represented. So, I'm glad to be here. But we are not narrow nationalists. We come from the tradition of Parnell and Hume. Our vision is big and it is broad, and our mission is to unite all of our people, not divide them any further. So we intend to represent nationalists, unionists and everybody else, and we will do that to the best of our ability. But Mr Speaker, this Prime Minister wants to drag us out of the European Union against our will. And I know he's got a huge majority, but the only majority that I'm concerned about is the pro-Remain majority in Northern Ireland that has thankfully now got its voice back in this place. And we may be few in number, Mr Deputy Speaker, but we intend to be very, very loud in voice. The Prime Minister's approach to Brexit is totally reckless. It drives a coach and horses through the Good Friday Agreement and the relationships that we have built up over many years right across our community and right across our islands. And I'm glad to see now that the DUP are very concerned about the checks between this island and our island. It's a pity they didn't think about that when they drove the Brexit agenda, when they rejected Theresa May's deal, and now we're in a situation that none of us are happy with. We're in a situation that every one of us should be trying to reverse and reject. Equally damaging to our progress and our peace process, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the current proposal to basically give an amnesty for British soldiers for whatever they carried out in Northern Ireland during our very, very difficult troubles. I come from a place called Derry, Mr Deputy Speaker, and in 1972, 14 innocent civil rights marchers were gunned down by the British Army on the streets of Derry. They were demanding their rights. They were marching against internment, and an international tribunal has stood by the fact that they were innocent and they were unlawfully killed. Is prosecuting those veterans, Mr Deputy Speaker, vexatious? No, it is not. We will resist this attempt to undermine our peace process and our political progress, and this insult to victims, all of the victims of our terrible, terrible past, and their opportunity that has been denied to them since 1998 to find full truth and full justice. We stand by every single one of those victims, no matter who the perpetrator was, and people on opposite benches need to understand this. If you begin with an amnesty for the British Army, you will end up with an amnesty for everybody. That is the door that you are opening up with this proposal. So it would better suit this Prime Minister and this government to stand by all of the victims, all of the innocent victims who have been searching for truth and justice for far too long. I will end with one other comment, Mr Deputy Speaker. Proposal has been mentioned today by a number of people, including the Prime Minister, who says, watch this space. They want to build a bridge from Scotland to Northern Ireland. Well, they would be much better suited building a decent road from Belfast to Derry. Thank you very much.
Victoria Prentice.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's always a pleasure and an honour indeed to follow a maiden speech. And though I didn't agree with everything that the honourable gentleman, who is new to this place but remarkably fluent and adept at using the chamber, I do absolutely applaud his desire to speak for all his constituents, whether or not they voted for him, and I'm sure we'll be hearing much more from him in this place. It is an enormous honour to have been re-elected for the third time in a very short number of years to represent my home area of Banbury, Bicester and 62 villages, and a great excitement to be part of what the Prime Minister describes as his stonking majority. It is a great pleasure to be able to speak in this debate and to follow some very important speeches, one from the Honourable Lady from Maidenhead, who spoke, as she has done so powerfully before, about social justice, and also my honourable friend from Tunbridge Wells, who made a very, very important speech about being the party of one nation and how we should come together and celebrate that. It's fair to say, Mr Deputy Speaker, that in the referendum, Banbury had the closest result in the nation. In Banbury, we voted to leave by 500 votes. So 3 years ago, probably about half of my constituents wanted to get Brexit done. That's not how they feel now. I have lost count of the number of times that people told me our slogan on the doorstep before I did. There were a coalescence of views from former Liberals and former Labour voters who reinforced again and again their strong belief in democracy and in doing the right thing and in respecting how people voted 3 years ago. They were passionate about it. I do believe that it is important that this government, this stonking democracy, delivers for everyone. I'm thrilled, having gone on about it rather a lot in the previous Parliament, that we leave the EU, if tomorrow goes as the Prime Minister expects it will, with a deal. I also hope that his negotiations for a trade deal next year go as well as he hopes they will do, and that we are able to protect the motor industry in Banbury and the just-in-time jobs on which we depend locally and in so much of our area. Far, far more important to Banbury than the EU, though, Mr Deputy Speaker, is the Horton General Hospital. And this is what people really wanted to talk about on the doorstep day after day. I was able to tell them that with the new investment from this government, it is likely that we will be able to build a new modular set of buildings on the Horton site, which will make it truly fit for the future. I noticed, after a very minor and very silly accident, which I had myself during the campaign, that we now have a severe parking problem at the Horton General Hospital because so many more procedures are in fact being undertaken there. What I want is to make sure that the buildings are fit for purpose and that we are able to bring maternity back to Banbury in the very near future so that babies, like I was, are able to be born there in the future. People also wanted to talk to me about school funding. We live in a historically underfunded area, and I'm glad too to hear what we heard over the course of the campaign on this issue. But right up the agenda, before Brexit, just after the Horton, was the environment. It was the subject that people, women in particular, but people of all ages, wanted to talk about on the doorstep, in hustings, in schools, anywhere I went. This was, I believe, an ambitious Queen's speech on the agenda, but real change in this area is going to require behavioural change, which is going to be difficult from all of us. I'm pleased that I was able to work in a small way on creating ideas like the Great British Spring Clean and in helping the reduction in single-use plastics in the last Parliament. I think there are real green opportunities and a real chance now for the government to shape policy both across industry and across people's lives in this agenda, and I look forward to working on that. One thing I did learn, particularly at the end of the last Parliament, was the importance of cross-party working, when I was proud to take part in MPs for a Deal, which had some enormous success, if I may say so, when 19 very brave members of the opposition voted with this side of the House for the second reading of the Withdrawal Act. I would like to pay tribute in particular to my friend from Don Valley who lost her seat and who did more perhaps than any other to represent Leave voters on that side of the House at a very difficult time in our parliamentary democracy. It was a leap of faith working cross-party, but to my mind it was worth it, and we gained more than we could quantify, perhaps, from the unpleasant atmosphere that surrounded those difficult votes. So I hope in this Parliament, despite our stonking majority, that we will work together on the environment, on, in particular, social care, which my honourable friend from Southend mentioned earlier, and something in which I have a very personal interest, which is in achieving good deaths for our citizens. As he said earlier, we know that just as we know that taxes happen to us, we know that death will happen to us all. And I do think it's important that we focus on the way that we enable people's deaths to take place. We hope at home, we hope peacefully, and we work together on that. I also have a personal priority in justice. And I myself will take, I hope, a keen interest in this Parliament in the work of the new Royal Commission, which has been announced today on justice. Of course I welcome this. I welcome any interest in justice, Mr Deputy Speaker. I've been banging on about this area for the last 25 years. Most of my waking thoughts for the last 25 years have been about our justice system. So of course a Royal Commission is a good thing. But I very much hope it acts speedily, that the right people are elected to it or appointed to it. And I hope that it looks very closely at the reports, of which I am rather proud, of the Justice Select Committee from the last two parliaments, particularly our reports on probation and on the prison population. Quite a large and weighty report, I must confess. But, of course.
I'm most grateful to my honourable friend giving way and just building on the issue she had about cross-party working, which is very important. The member for Barnsley East earlier on mentioned about sentencing. I urge my honourable friend to take a serious look at this. Two young lads, Harry Whitlam, Callum Walk, killed, constituents of mine killed by drunk drivers. Callum's killer, an HGV Bulgarian driver, drank a bottle of vodka, drove straight over his car, killed him the day before his 20th birthday, was out of prison in 3 years. Harry Whitlam's killer, who was 5 times over the drink drive limit, killed him on a farm, could only be prosecuted under the Health and Safety Act, got 18 months, 11 years old. Could I urge my honourable friend, when looking into the sentencing and bringing that cross-party work together, that the families who mourn the loss of their children, Callum was an only child, that we do recognise that if you intoxicate yourself, it is manslaughter. It's not an accident, it's manslaughter, and it should carry a similar sentence.
Victoria Prentice. I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, which raises a very, very serious issue, which has been discussed a great deal from both sides of this House over the last few years. I think you will have heard earlier the Prime Minister give an undertaking to incorporate that in part of the sentencing review, and he does touch on a very important difficulty that we have when talking about justice. Of course, when we consider sentencing, we do think about a punitive element. But I hope that we will remember when we consider sentencing going forward that the aim of us all, even those of us who have spent 25 years often advocating for prisoners' rights, is that we want to reduce crime and we want to make sure that we protect future victims by stopping crime ever happening again. So what is so important is that we concentrate on reforming people whilst in prison. We do not lock them up and throw away the key, because nearly everybody who goes into prison is coming out again. And I think it's really important that we have informed debate in this House. We must recognise now that we're over the 20% mark of people in prison having committed a sexual offence. There are a large number of sexual offenders in prison who are coming out again. And we have to think very, very carefully about the treatment they're given in prison, the effort we put into reforming them, and how we supervise them when they're released. I think that's, sorry, Mr Deputy Speaker, that is my bandwagon, as you know. You've heard me talk about it before. But I would like to, in this Parliament, concentrate once again on the justice sphere, and I hope that I'll be able to do that. So, in conclusion, it's a great honour to have been re-elected. It's a great honour to be part of an enthusiastic one-nation government that's going to get things done. And I would like to conclude by asking you all to remember that Christmas is a time of enormous goodwill, but also gives us a few days off to reflect and think about what we're going to do better next year. So Merry Christmas to all, and I hope we come back refreshed and enthused about both getting Brexit done, but everything else we want to do too.
Yeah. Jim Shannon. Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. It's an absolute pleasure to follow the Honourable Lady for Banbury and thank her for her contribution. I'm also very pleased to see you in your place, Mr Deputy Speaker, but also can I say, in his absence, very nice to see Mr Speaker in the position he has in this House. He is a worthy gentleman, and I look forward very much to catching his eye often. I also wish to welcome home some old faces and to welcome some new, and there's some we're able to have a friendship with again who were in the House in 2015 to 2017 and then were absent for a short time and they're back again. Some of the new faces, and I'm making my business with the help of the wee directorate we have here with all the new names and try to introduce myself to them as well and help them in this House the way whenever I came in here in 2010 that many members in this House, especially on this side, took the time to help me. It will be an honour to work with you as we attempt to do what the electorate have resoundingly called for us to do in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to get this country off her knees and standing firmly on solid ground. At the election on the early hours of Friday morning, I was obviously very privileged to be re-elected as a member for Strangford once again. And I thank my God for that victory, and I do it in this House as well, because it's very clear to me that that's where the first thanks should be to my God and Saviour for giving us the victory that we did have in Strangford. At the election, I also said that the DUP voice of Strangford will be heard. And today in this chamber, on the first occasion that there is, the voice of the DUP in Strangford through this member will be heard. I'm very pleased also to hear I congratulate the honourable member for Foyle for his contribution in this House. Obviously, we have a very different constitutional position, but I am very pleased. I did say this before me, and he knows this. I said, look, there will be things that we disagree with, but there are many things in this House that we will agree with and we will work together on. So, although we come from a different political background, we will be together in many things in this House on behalf of the constituents of Strangford and the constituents of Foyle, because both need the same things, and let's see what we can do to make that happen. How heartening it is to see the rise of the pound against the dollar, which was £1 or £1.80 during my family holiday in August, and is now sitting at 1.32 when I last checked. How heartening to see that the world is aware that the days of infighting and bickering is at an end, and the ability to do something and deliver is now at the government's feet, and we look to the government to do that. I want to sow into the mix the most important aspects that Her Majesty's has so graciously raised today. I declare an interest as a former member of the Ulster Defence Regiment and a member of the Territorial Army, the Royal Artillery, for collectively some 14.5 years. I welcome government's commitment to the military covenant, and I ask government whenever they say that not to have it in words only, but to have it in action as well. And we will see that same commitment in Northern Ireland, because it's so important that those who have served in uniform in Northern Ireland, those who need the help of the military covenant and aren't getting it, have that opportunity. And I wish to see that happening. So it's words, not words, it's action we need. I also welcome the government's commitment to the 2% spend on defence commitment within NATO, and would urge other NATO countries to look towards that and see what they could do to match that, where our government has taken that step in the right direction. I'm also very, very pleased to welcome government's commitment to some of their building controls and rental accommodation, and how those changes will be made. The commitment from the government is made to knife control as well. And very much welcome, and have said it before in this House, welcome government's commitment to the zero carbon by 2050 and the environmental issues that they put forward. Also within that process, we're very pleased to see that the National Farmers Union and the Ulster Farmers Union, the sister organisation in Northern Ireland, are committed to those same things. And if the farming community is committed to the 2050 carbon zero, then it's something that we should welcome. I've asked the government has mentioned in the Queen's speech something about immigration. And I haven't spoken to the Minister already, and the honourable gentleman that just can't, you don't see him in the chamber at the moment, from the Conservative Party, and I have discussed this matter, and we need to have the Tier 2 visas for the fishermen and for the fishing sector. And because if we have those Tier 2 visas in place, then those who keep the boats in Portavogie and Ardglass and Kilkeel going, then we can have that. So the Minister has from Torbay, member for Torbay, has indicated he's willing to consider this, and we look forward to those things happening. Government has given a commitment in the last chamber and the last session of this House for the envoy, the special envoy on the persecution of Christians. It's something that I'm particularly interested in, and I know this House is also interested in. So I want to make sure that government commits themselves to doing that again, and maybe when we're summing up sometime in the future, the Minister can confirm that that would be the case. I had the Honourable Member and Minister for Rochester and Stroud over in my constituency before the election was actually called, and she has responsibility for retail in the high street. And like my honourable friend for East Antrim, I recognise that government has some good ideas to help the high street and also to help the retail business. So those are things that we wish to see. I'm very much a community man in my constituency, and I keep my ear to the ground. So I wasn't surprised when I went to the doors in Strangford to hear that the main issues were getting a functioning assembly up and going. Talks are ongoing, and I know the Secretary of State has been working extremely hard with other parties to begin the journey to bring the parties together to do what they have been elected and prevented from doing, from legislating and running Northern Ireland. We very much hope that those talks will be successful, and we look forward to that happening. The next issue is Brexit, the stalemate, the preservation of the Union and the way forward. But I have to say this, on the doors in Strangford, the most important thing wasn't necessarily Brexit, it was the Union. So I challenge government, challenge the Minister, those who are here and the party members as well, of the importance of having the Union secured. And after the divergence for Northern Ireland, how would Scotland follow? I look to my Scots Nats friends and comrades and here in the chamber. I don't want them to leave the great United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I want them to stay. I want the Scots Nats Party to recognise that the large majority of people in Scotland want to stay within the United Kingdom, and it's only a minority that want to leave. So the government has got a job to do, and the job is to persuade my Scots Nats friends and comrades of the need to stay in the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and I hope that he can do that. What would the PM's aforementioned deal look like in reality? The fishing industry, this time through Alan McCullough and the Anglo-North Irish Fish Producers Organisation, have posed this interesting scenario, which I feel deserves airing and clarification. It's so important that we look at what this deal that the Prime Minister has brought forward will mean to us. Brexit offers Northern Ireland, and I quote, Brexit offers Northern Ireland's fishing industry once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. This is what the Minister says. It will end the inequality, the hypocrisy and the disrespect of Europe's common fisheries policy, which has damaged the fishing industry in County Down. However, imagine this scenario, and this scenario is a real scenario because it comes through the Prime Minister's withdrawal agreement that he's put forward. A County Down fisherman owns a UK registered trawler. On the 1st of January 2021, the trawler sails from Portavogie, from Ardglass or Kilkeel. For the next few days, it fishes in the UK territorial waters in the Irish Sea. The trawler complies with the rules of the UK's new fisheries policy. Its catch is recorded against UK fishing quotas. It then returns to Kilkeel, to Ardglass, to Portavogie, to land and sell its catch entirely within the UK. However, the interpretation and what this withdrawal agreement does, it means that the Northern Ireland Protocol is that if the UK registered trawler wants to land its catch in Northern Ireland, it will be treated as though it's a trawler from a third country and will be required to submit a series of documents that, although are not new, are not currently required, and there will be tariffs on the fish. So whenever my fishermen leave Portavogie, go across the harbour, go 1 mile out to sea, what happens? They catch the fish, they bring it back in, they're due tariffs. This agreement, indirectly or directly, disadvantages my fishermen in Portavogie. We accept that in the absence of a free deal trade with the EU, these documents may well be required for exports to the EU, but they should not be needed if the catch is destined for our most important markets in Scotland, England and Wales, all within the United Kingdom. The Conservative Party manifesto stated, "We will ensure that Northern Ireland's businesses and producers enjoy unfettered access to the rest of the UK." Urgent clarification, Minister, is needed on this issue, that the travesty outlined above will not happen, that they won't face the tariffs, that they won't face the bureaucracy has been put forward, and it's so important that we do that. Just today, my fishermen in Portafogie, in the constituency of Strangford, have been told that under the new fishing discussions that took place in Brussels just yesterday in the day, that we will face a 15% reduction in our prawn quota catch in the Irish Sea. And I put on record my dismay that that is happening, because that will impact greatly amongst those in my constituency who realise and know that the prawn quota is so important for our fishing sector, for our economy and for the jobs it creates. Can I just say this as well? Because this is what it means. This government, through the withdrawal agreement,